State Henry Kissinger will continue after we take a short break. C-SPAN's Election 92 programming offers complete and balanced coverage of the political process. From this summer's conventions to Election Day, through the inauguration, C-SPAN brings you exclusive gavel-to-gavel coverage from the presidential campaign trail. This political season makes C-SPAN your primary source for election coverage. Coming next, we return to Capitol Hill for the final portion of Tuesday's morning session of the Select Committee on POW and MIA Affairs in the Senate. At the witness table is former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. As the members reconvene, Senator Bob Kerrey, Democrat of Nebraska, is about to be recognized to begin his round of questions.
Hearing will come back to order. Before I turn to Senator Kerrey, Bob Kerrey, let me reemphasize what I have said, and I think that a little bit of this dialogue has become too much of a rehash of the war itself and circumstance. We are really trying to not let that happen. Dr. Kissinger Secretary Kissinger is 100% correct when he suggests, and the committee, incidentally, just so the record is clear, has followed this course because we went to Vietnam. We have made very specific requests of the Vietnamese. A process is underway with the Vietnamese. And indeed, the most significant issue in terms of accounting is getting the full accounting from them. Just as one should not, and I think we are not trying to suggest that that there is a culpability per se with respect to POWs on behalf of Secretary Kissinger, so I think it is fair to say that the Congress or the peace movement or other people are equally not to blame for the issue of POW. They are all part of the dynamic that the country confronted and that were part of the negotiations. But the fair question that is being asked is what happened in those months in terms of the relationship between the families, the POW community, the people who 20 years later are still feeling that somehow the government didn't level with them or that there wasn't a direct response. Now, these are agonizing questions. It's not fun. As I said at the outset, there are plenty of places all of us would perhaps prefer to be. But I think with the questioning and with the answers to these questions, a very healthy process is going on. And I hope we can continue to make it that, because I think out of this will come a much better understanding of what happened back then and help all of us to make some decisions. Senator Bob Kerrey.
Mr. Secretary, first of all, I'm very sympathetic with the difficulty of trying to recollect what happened and what you did 20-some years ago. So sympathetic, in fact, that I would not want the tables reversed and have someone asking me questions of what I did some 25 years ago. Fortunately, I wasn't a public servant at the time and had considerably more liberty than you. I would observe that an awful lot of us have held a pretty fast attitude towards Vietnam, and an awful lot of us have shelved the history of it. We've argued it, we've debated it, we've lived it, and we've, to a very large extent, put it behind us. This issue of the POW MIA has reopened it. And in particular, I would say, Mr. Secretary, in my opening remarks, I referred to a considerable amount of secrecy, an attitude, the need to maintain secrecy by the administration. And I say that particularly because my own views of both the negotiation and the effort on behalf of the POW-MIA and the likelihood that men were still alive in 1973 has two periods. One I would call before Senator Grassley's efforts, successful to declassify much of the information that had previously been classified, and my attitude post-declassification. I understand the need to protect national security and to keep things classified, but I do think that we excessively classified. And part of what's going on today is a re-examination based upon now having new information. And by the way, Dr. Kissinger, what I intend to do is give you some information about my views, since you know less about me and my views than I know about yours, give you an opportunity to respond, and then I've got 2 or 3 questions, if time allows, specific questions that I'd like to ask. You said it's bad and cynical history. Well, I observe respectively that I think it's much more apt to be a speed bump, a reevaluation that occurs as a consequence now of having new information, new opportunity to look. My own examination has caused wild swings, both in my mood, at times very angry, as a consequence of getting partial information, I'll admit, getting very sad as a consequence of seeing what are perceived as opportunities lost. Again, admittedly, it's easy to make that examination 20 years hence, but I'm just trying to tell you that I've had powerful feelings in the last 4 or 5 days as I've read the details of the negotiation, in particular read the details of the peace treaty itself. I must say it's the first time I've actually examined that document. I should declare to you that in regards to leaks, I nearly resigned from this committee in a dispute that occurred as a consequence of information being driven to the public prior to our committee's opportunity to both examine and make decisions. And so I'm also not only very sympathetic with that, I think it is a mistake for either committee members or staff to try to reach conclusions prior to our examining all of the evidence and trying in a thoughtful fashion to say, first of all, what did happen, and secondly, what can we do to assist General Vesey in narrowing and getting a full accounting now, and lastly, what should we be doing with the government of Vietnam today? You said in your testimony that no one is left behind by, in your language, a deliberate act or negligent omission. I would say to you, Ms. Secretary, I don't intend to prove this. It's not my intent to try to prove there was a deliberate act or negligent omission. In fact, as I read it today, I see no deliberate act or negligent omission. But nonetheless, I also don't intend to accept that as a standard of performance. That if I'm unable to prove negligence, or if I'm unable to prove some sort of deliberation, that I don't have cause to say that perhaps we could have done things differently. Indeed, again, the purpose being to try to figure out what we ought to be doing today as we negotiate with the government of Vietnam, because we are now, whatever leverage we had in 1973, we have considerably less leverage today, and the issue is still there. We're still trying to negotiate with them. I should also at this point point out that I myself have been criticized by some of taking too current hardline attitude towards the Vietnam government. My own belief is that a full accounting of our people will not occur until the Vietnamese government itself is accountable to its own people. This is a government that has lied to its people ever since they seized illegitimate power in 1975. They have continued to lie and misrepresent facts to their own people. On Ho Chi Minh's mausoleum there are the words independence and freedom. I believe they did achieve independence, but I do not believe the people of Vietnam have achieve freedom. I've also, I will say at this point, been accused, and I'm uncertain whether the accusations have merit, that I'm too naive in regards to the idea of freedom for the people of Vietnam. That in discussing the possibility that the people of Vietnam could be free today, or that we have to measure our own acceptance of their offers today to help us with POWs, measured by their own willingness to provide freedom for their people. I am sometimes accused by people of saying that's too naive a view. Indeed, former Secretary of State Haig yesterday said that we ought to be very careful in talking about freedom, that we ought to be talking instead just about economic cooperation. We ought to be talking instead about other sorts of things like that. What I'm trying to say to you, Mr. Secretary, is that there's a current issue with the POWs, as well as a historical issue. And the historical issue should, properly examined by us, provide some information upon which we can make decisions about what we ought to be doing today to get a full accounting with the government of Vietnam. And your own experience having negotiated with the government of Vietnam, though some would argue it's less hardline, I see the current Politburo being just as hardline as Le Duc Tho was in 1973. Perhaps it's not, but your own advice there would be valuable. In your own testimony, there was a moment when you did not need to reference your printed words when you spoke very movingly of an America that had saved you and your family from totalitarianism. There were an awful lot of us who grew a bit skeptical of the Cold War as a consequence of our own experience, whose skepticism melted when we saw the miracle of East Germany becoming liberated, and Czechoslovakia and Hungary and Poland becoming liberated. And we were not only amazed at the courageous spirit of the people in Eastern Europe and of the now newly independent states, but we were amazed to find the destruction of totalitarianism and how indeed terrible it had been. I myself had a moment in Vietnam a year and a half or so ago where I was instructed to visit as an evidence that the government of Vietnam had opened the political process, a man who had been held as a re-education student as a result of his having been a part of the South Vietnam government and now a member of the parliament. After having a photograph taken with me, he turned and he said, "Senator, we believed you." It was the most difficult moment that I've had in the whole re-examination of Vietnam. Though I may be accused of being naive, I believe the cause of freedom should have been the cause that sustained us. I'm intrigued, Mr. Secretary, by the language of Article 21, which seems to imply the potential of a vision. The Article 21 of the Peace Treaty implies the possibility of a new relationship with Vietnam, given certain things happen. I regret my own conclusion that at the time, not only had Congress not provided the resources, but it seems to me the people of America, for, in many cases, good reason, had given up on that cause, didn't feel that cause, didn't feel the cause was worthwhile. We were still engaged in that cause in Eastern Europe. We were not engaged in that cause in Vietnam. And still today are encouraged by some to say that cause is not worthwhile, when I indeed believe that it is. I'm intrigued, Mr. Secretary, as I read the peace document and as I read the negotiations and as I consider, perhaps naively, I'm intrigued by the possibility of what might have been, both in terms of our own families feeling more comfort about missing in action, but also by what might have happened for the people of Vietnam. What might have happened had we done things differently, had the cause of freedom still been felt by the people of America. I just don't believe it was in 1973, regrettably. And I think it's very important, at least in my view, for us in 1992 to say that that is the cause that engages us today, both for the purpose of saying that those of us who fought for something that was just, but also for the purpose, Mr. Secretary, of getting a final accounting of our missing in action. I have some questions that I'd like to ask, and I just give you an opportunity if you'd like to respond. Anything I may have said that you don't agree with, or anything you might say that just be in simple response.
Well, Senator, what you said is, I think it's very moving, and it goes to the heart of America's role in the world. America is a very special country. It's the only country that's ever been created in history for the purpose of the idea of liberty, and to which people came to be free of their old societies and at the same time join a society that was built in the name of freedom and human rights. This has given America a very special quality. Then good fortune isolated America from the rest of the world physically, so that for 200 years nearly, America did not have to concern itself with the problem of security in the normal sense of other nations, that the changes that it would take to threaten American security were so vast that it would always take a global kind of conflict to involve us. I say this because it produced a kind of exceptionalism for America, the belief that our ideas are universally applicable and immediately translatable into political action, and that some of the nasty business of security was something we could avoid. And we could for a greater part of our history. Now, I believe we have to stand for freedom. And our people have to believe that that's what we stand for, because otherwise there is no basis for action. The difficulty in our foreign relations now in this world is, how do you translate this into action? And where I sometimes differ with people whose values I greatly respect is that some of them seem to think you can sort of apply it automatically and that it will happen by itself, or it will happen if only you affirm the idea of freedom enough. I believe that our faith in our values has to give us the strength to do the difficult things and to enable us to navigate in complex situations, but not lose sight of what we're trying to do. Now, you mentioned Vietnam. Vietnam presented us two problems. One is at home. I came into this as a professor of government at Harvard. Almost all of my friends were on your side of the political dividing
At that time,
line.
I was on your side.
Oh, you were on my side. Well, they were on the Democratic side, and most of them were on the liberal side. Now, I did not agree with their view on Vietnam, but I agreed with the motives that produced them, and this produced a great ambivalence in me. As you read in all the accounts of the period, I spent a lot of time with the peace movement people, including a fellow who was fasting in front of the White House. People said I did it in order to win them over. I couldn't win them over, but I wanted to create the basis for a later consensus. But I became passionate, and I still am. Almost everything we've discussed here today, we could have dealt with as a united people if there had been a minimum of confidence. But I hate to say this, but if we had made a huge effort, if we had made a huge explanation that we wanted to bomb because of the prisoners, there would have been a debate on that issue and that was an invention. There was just not a minimum of confidence, and I don't want to ascribe fault. There were some mistakes made by the administration, but there were also many, many mistakes made by the critics. Now let me go to Vietnam. Vietnam we were dealing with a society, almost, as I said earlier, monomaniacally obsessed with itself. It is the only society that was occupied by China for hundreds of years, which retained its identity, did not take Chinese script writing, but they have done this by being focused on themselves with a single-mindedness that has enabled them to survive, but also makes it very difficult for them to understand other societies. Now, here we had the problem of South Vietnam. I tell you, when we entered it, I have been studying this now for a book I'm writing, not on Vietnam, but just how did we get into it? It is interesting that 4 American presidents, from Truman on, were convinced that the freedom of South Vietnam was essential for American security and were never challenged. And suddenly in 1967, when President Johnson, carrying out what all his predecessors had affirmed, and what in the first 2 years of the war was also not challenged, suddenly it turned into an issue not just of prudence, which I would have agreed with, but an issue of American morality. And after that, the Vietnam debate got totally out of control. in the sense of the inability to create a national consensus. Now, here we had the problem in South Vietnam. One can always escape one's dilemmas by asking for perfection as a precondition for action. The South Vietnamese were not democratic by tradition, they had no experience with it, and we planted a government there in actually the Kennedy administration that as a result of a coup, but they were attempting to become more democratic, unsatisfactorily, with great confusion. But I believe that if they could have preserved their independence, they would be at least as far as Korea is today, which is not perfect, but is developing a multi-party system with many blemishes. We in the government that inherited that war, we didn't start it, we thought it was against America's fundamental honor to turn over millions of people that in reliance on our word had adopted a certain course to the communists, which was the only option we were ever, in fact, given until October 8, 1972. I tell you, to negotiate with Thieu was only slightly more pleasurable than negotiating with Lee Duc-tho. It was also not because these are people that have very single-minded attitude. Now today, I almost recuse myself from Vietnam debates. I've been so bruised, and they've damaged my country so much by these divisions that I'm always afraid I'm not rational, so I'm not taking any public positions. I do no business there in my consulting firm. I take no clients who do business there. But I don't object to it if people feel they must do it. I cannot certainly make peace with them until they give us the accounting myself. But it is, one should someday study this problem from the point of view of the complexities we faced and the anguish it caused to people on all sides of this debate.
Mr. Secretary, do you think it's possible or probable that Americans were still alive in April of '73 in Laos or Vietnam?
I think it's improbable that any are alive today. I honestly did not think there were any alive in Vietnam when the war ended. I have always kept open the possibility in my mind that there were some in Laos. I want to make one point which you also referred to. Unbelievable as this looks in retrospect, one of our big hopes when the peace was made, and one of the reasons Article 21 was written this way, and I appreciate you noticing it, we really thought that we should make a big effort to get North Vietnam into the community, if not of nations, to see whether we could establish a more normal relationship. And since Mr. Codina has all the records, let him show you my concluding remarks when we had made the October 8th agreement to Lee Duc-tho in a secret session. Nobody ever thought this would become public. It will give you the mood, which may have been a little naive, of where we might go if that agreement were implemented.
I have time perhaps for a single question. Mr. Secretary, again, the object is to try to make progress today by acquiring information about what happened 20-some years ago. Thus, if there was a moment where you say, here's a situation where I made a judgment, and today I would knowing what I know now, I wouldn't make that judgment today. It's certainly not an admission of negligence on my part. I mean, there are things one acquires after the fact that You negotiate in good faith, and you think that you're going to get something, you hope you're going to get something, and you don't. Once burned, you learn not to do it again. And that's the kind of information I'm trying to get with this question. On the 20th of October, '72, in a cable from Hague to Colonel Gui in Paris, you propose that North Vietnam issue a unilateral statement that it undertakes to make arrangements, that's the quote, undertakes to make arrangements for the return of POWs and an MIA accounting. You cited a previous late October agreement that North Vietnam, again a quote, will make itself responsible, end of the quote, for this. North Vietnam responded the next day with a cable that they would not make such a unilateral statement. They did say, however, that the, again a quote, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, the South Vietnamese, will carry out without a change, or excuse me, the North Vietnamese, the DRV, without a change, what it has declared to the United States side, end of the quote, and again a quote, will do its utmost to come to an agreement with its allies, end of the quote. They added that the Pathet Lao had said they would release their POWs within 60 days of the signing of a Vietnam ceasefire. A day later, on the 22nd of October 1972, an Al Haig cable to Colonel Gui says, the President, again quotes, notes with appreciation, and to quote, the North Vietnamese message, again a quote, which satisfied all his points with respect to Laos and Cambodia as well as U.S. prisoner, end of quotes. Now, I should point out again that this information is recently released. Our capacity to talk about this particular document came, again, mostly as a consequence of Senator Grassley's efforts to get it declassified. I think it can be useful, handled in the proper way. Now, the question that I have is, did you agree with the President? Or were there further points regarding U.S. prisoners that you still wanted?
I'd have to say yes to both questions. I probably would have liked further points, and I agreed with the President. First of all, in fairness to the President, I have to say that his message was either drafted by me or followed my recommendation. There's no way that the President would have made, I don't remember exactly how it was done, but it is not possible that in a negotiation that I conducted, the President would send a message that he had not fully discussed with me.
At that point, though, were you confident that North Vietnam would release all U.S. prisoners in Indochina?
No, I was confident that my basic view was that of all the provisions of the agreement, that was the one where they faced the greatest threat of our retaliation if they didn't carry it out. And let me point out, this was such a convoluted exchange of messages that in this message, the North Vietnamese incorporated in their reply where they say we are carrying out all the assurances we've previously given you. There is one, it's almost unreadable, but it says the DRV will also assure that the provision in the general agreement for verification of those U.S. military men and civilians considered missing in action will be applied also in Laos and Cambodia, this is all part of the same complex of exchanges which they are confirming here, and that President Nixon is confirming.
As I understand it, the idea of agreeing to an exchange of prisoner list, and again, I point out that it has relevance for our negotiations with Vietnam today. That the idea of an exchange of a list at the day that the agreement was signed, that decision had been made in August of 1971. Is that correct or not?
I already said to Mr. Codina, who went to law school in America, not in Hanoi, that it's difficult to apply American standards here because he, quite correctly, there's no criticism of the Council. When we look at these documents, we think that every negotiation sort of has a history, and what you said in August 71 then becomes part of the record and goes on. Now, with the Vietnamese, that simply wasn't the case.
But it seemed, as far as we're concerned, to be settled. Is that not true?
Well, it was our proposal, but then it started all over again in 72. But this was something we were willing to do.
The reason I raise it, Mr. Secretary, and I should say it again for the public's understanding, all these documents have not been unclassified, and with the requests that we've put in about both to the archives and to the Library of Congress, with your permission, the instructions were that we were going to receive documents that related where discussions occurred about the POW-MIA. We received very few documents in that early stage of negotiations when, as you said earlier, the North Vietnamese tabled an offer on the 6th or so of October 1972 that was essentially an acceptance of what President Nixon had offered in May of that year. We see very little discussions of the MIA POW issue in those early days, leading us to conclude that the idea of a list exchange at the day of the signing had been settled.
My basic strategy with the POWs and MIAs was always to have a demand on the table, but never to beat up on it, because until we had an agreement in principle, nothing was going to happen anyway. And our eagerness was already sufficiently demonstrated in the Hotel Majestic.
Are you saying that there was a demand on the table to change that so that we would alter the terms under which we'd receive a list? That the United States had a demand on the table to change that particular term?
No, I don't remember exactly the sequence you're talking about, Senator. It's my problem. In every negotiation, well, there were various phases of the negotiation. There was one block of negotiations in October 71, from May 71 to November 71, where the Vietnamese put us through the ringer in putting forward, I forget, 9 public and 7 secret proposals, or maybe it was the other way around. Told us they wanted to discuss the secret proposals, but demanded publicly that we answer the public proposals, creating total confusion in the public mind. In that sequence, we put forward a proposal for prisoner lists. In any negotiation, you then have to adjust as you go along to see what you can possibly get, as long as we got the fundamental issue of getting our prisoners in a way that was related to other conditions.
Did you think, I mean, you mentioned the criticism that you received from the left, supposedly left, about ending the war. There was also, as I understand it, criticism from the right that you were negotiating too fast, or that there was some kind of a...
No.
No?
The right didn't get heroic until it was all over.
There was no criticism from people who had formerly supported your efforts.
No, we got some criticism on Soviet negotiations. On Vietnam negotiations, we got no criticism from the right. Not that I remember. That was not a major factor.
It's not an accurate statement that Mr. Kramer, for example, Mr. Fritz Kramer, for example...
Well, Mr. Kramer is a man to whom I owe a huge amount of my intellectual development, and he has been a huge influence on my life. I think he is more a part of the Prussian than of the American tradition, which is no reflection on him. You cannot call him a figure from the American right. Kramer's fundamental view is that you shouldn't negotiate with communists at all. And therefore, and it's been a source of great anguish to me that the man who was my mentor through so many years, had a different view. But he looks at it philosophically, and I had to look at it practically. I had to deal with the situation in which our country found itself, and the idea that you would fight this war to a total victory, which would have been his preference, and one that I, by instinct, would have also far preferred, was no longer open. But from the American right, and I don't say this invidiously of Kramer. Kramer is a man who left Germany not because he was part of an oppressed minority, but out of conviction. But he is a man who is opposed to negotiating with what he considers evil. And when you are in government, you have the painful obligation to negotiate. That was the problem with Kramer.
Just one last question, Mr. Chairman. When this offer was tabled in October of '72, as my read of it is, again, I saw you nodding, and I think you agree that was the North Vietnamese essentially accepting an offer that you had put on the table, or that President Nixon had put on the table of May of that year. So it appeared.
I tell you, let me describe what happened.
I'll just finish the statement, then I'll let you describe it. It seems to me, and if this is not accurate, I appreciate what you're saying, but it seems to me that there was some recognition that this indeed could be the end game. That they have accepted much of what we had offered. They're now moving into the end game. And the question that I've got is whether or not you considered saying, thank you very, very much for the offer. I'll go back. We'll have meetings in the United States about this, and then we'll continue the negotiation. And whether or not today you've thought about whether or not that wouldn't have been an advisable thing to do.
Yeah, I've thought often about that, Senator. And let me describe to you exactly how we made the decision that we did. Almost all the people in the government who had been connected with the negotiation were with me there. General Haig, Winston Lord, many of the people that you had yesterday. When Lee Duc-Tho tabled the proposal, it was in the early afternoon of October 8th. I recognized immediately that that was the end of the war, because he had accepted what we had proposed on May 8th publicly, and he had gone beyond it, because we had offered that there would be elections in Vietnam and that you would resign 2 months before the election and the caretaker government would take over. And the North Vietnamese, knowing Vietnamese psychology, knew this would never work. They agreed to Thieu to stay in power, to agree that there would be a Saigon government, that there'd be a Saigon government with which they would deal as a government. These were huge concessions in our mind, and it meant that we could end the war, and they accepted all the military terms and did better than, we hadn't been specific about infiltration and so forth. My colleagues and I first went to a nearby woods to caucus for an hour, and we concluded this would be the end of the war one way or the other. We went back to Lee Duc-Tho and said, we need 24 hours to think about this, although it's progress or whatever we said. Mr. Codina will have the text. Then we went back to the embassy where we stayed. I literally walked through the streets of Paris for, I don't know, hours, trying to clarify in my own mind what we should do, exactly along the lines of what you said. We had this choice. We could go home. We could go to Saigon. We could just start stalling. We had, in meetings with many groups, said forever that if we got the terms we asked for, we would end the war, that we were not pursuing the war, and that we were not making these proposals as gimmicks. We meant it. The problem we faced in going either back to New York, to Washington, or to Saigon was, I was pretty sure where President Nixon would come out, because we had talked about this a great deal. If we went to Saigon, the thing would blow up. And the result of that would be that the Vietnamese would publish the terms of what they had offered us, if it looked like any, and then we would be in an impossible position of dragging our feet when they have gone further than accepting what we had proposed, and for which we had been attacked in America for having asked for too much. There was no criticism that we had been too generous in our offers. If you look at what the Congress was saying and what the media were saying in May 1972, so I concluded, and this is my responsibility, I'd send President Nixon a cable saying something is happening here. He could, of course, have said, come on home. I thought, under the time pressures that they were, we were better off seeing what improvements we could get in the agreement. I thought I had caught them for the first time, as the chairman pointed out, in a mistaken assessment of the American situation. They thought that after the election we might be stronger. I thought that after the election the congressional pressures would get worse. And therefore I wanted to use this interval to get a maximum improvement in the position. In the 2 days of practically non-stop negotiation that ensued, one of the proposals was to set up something called a Committee for National Concord or Reconciliation, which in their first draft was practically a coalition-type government. We managed to reduce the functions of that committee so that it was almost meaningless, and so that Saigon and the PRG, that Saigon was recognized in the agreement as an independent entity. Secondly, and most importantly for these considerations, the Vietnamese had lumped all prisoners together, and the exchange of all prisoners was supposed to take place together. Now this meant that the Viet Cong that were in South Vietnamese prison camps, or any list that they could surface as political prisoners, would be used to hold our prisoners hostage. We got that eliminated in very long and painful negotiations in which the fate of the non-military prisoners, the North Vietnamese prisoners had to be returned, but none of the South Vietnamese prisoners had to be returned. And there were a whole series of improvements which we got in those 3 days. It was a very painful decision. Now, we thought that Thieu would be so relieved by having been recognized that we would be greeted as heroes when we brought this agreement to Saigon. Now, that turned out to be a misjudgment, which I say not as a reflection on Thieu, because his problem was he had to prove that he was independent, and he could not just take an agreement we had handed to him, so he had to struggle for a while.
Did he not have an objection to Article 1 as well, because since it referred to a single nation?
Well, you have to separate the real objections. They were very ingenious in raising a lot of objections. But the real problem we faced was this. He was marching to a different drummer than we were. We could not keep faith with the American people and not accept a proposal when they had accepted our proposal. And his position would have been infinitely worse if this thing had gotten published. There had been a huge controversy, and then the Senate or the Congress voted one of these many unilateral cutting off of funds resolutions, which, for example, Senator Fulbright was urging at that moment. I can only give you our reasoning. In retrospect, people can have a different conclusion. It would have come out about the same way, because whether we went home first and went back, the end result, I think we got better terms that way, unfortunately, since we couldn't enforce them they disintegrated. But that was our reasoning.
We are going to take one more round of questioning. As we agreed, Dr. Kissinger, we would recess at 12:15 to return at 2:30. So without ado, 1:15 and come back at 2:30. Senator Cassavam.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Unprepared as I am to ask this question. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I'd just like to say, Dr. Kissinger, that I think that your statement, opening statement, was an important perspective. It is hard for us, and particularly some of us who weren't as directly involved as many others are here speaking today, to keep in mind what happened 20 years ago and more, and to keep that in mind as we think through what should happen today. And I think Senator Kerry put it in very eloquent terms as well. I suppose really this committee was tasked to ask the question whether any Americans were left behind and are alive today. I think that, as many have stated, the fact that there were so many documents pertaining to those years that were kept classified unnecessarily so, I think now, for so long, it created a lot of questions and concerns that were never answered in a timely fashion. But you said, and I think this is important, that no prisoners were left behind by the deliberate act or negligent omission of American officials. I would like to ask you just a little bit, though, and in light of what you say the atmosphere was at the time, and certainly we're all very aware of that, you didn't read what's in your statement from an editorial in the Des Moines Register of April of '73, that it would be a grave mistake for the United States to decide the peace violations by the other side were intolerable and jump back into combat again. The agreement calls for the United States to get out and stay out and leave the Vietnamese to settle the future of Vietnam. And I think in many ways that does express very well what the sentiment was at that time, and that was April.
I think if you look at the appendices and what was said in the Congress and in the media at the time, you will find that that was the dominant view of what you've just read, Senator.
But I'd like to ask, just for my own clarification, a bit about the lists. First, though, and this has been brought up before, in the March 29th, '73 speech of President Nixon, he stated that all of our American prisoners of war are on their way home. Do you feel that President Nixon overstated the case?
Not in terms of the categories we had in our mind at the time. In terms of the refinements that Senator Smith presented earlier, one would probably have been more precise. But in our mind, there were only two categories. Either people were known as prisoners or they were missing in action. And therefore, what President Nixon conveyed was that those we knew were prisoners were on the way home. And he also said those who were missing in action we were not satisfied with. And that was the state of our classification at the time. We had no other categories intellectually. In our mind, if we got proof that somebody was alive, we would have moved him from missing in action into the prisoner category. So I believe it was a correct statement.
During the negotiations...
Incidentally, may I point out that something that is not relevant to your question, but Secretary Laird called my lawyer's office to correct what he thinks was maybe a wrong impression. He did not mean to say that he knew that prisoners were left behind. He knew that we didn't know. He said what I'm saying. But I want to point out, he did not say this to me. This is a message that I got in the break. But you might check it with him directly. Excuse me.
I think that's true. I think many have indicated that certainly anybody who was sensitive to the situation had to realize there could well be Americans there, just as you have said. That seems to me to go without saying in many ways. The question is, of course, going back again just a moment to negotiations and the lists. During the negotiations, did you present to the Vietnamese list of prisoners of war, of names that we had that were prisoners of war?
I did after the. I did not do it before the agreement was signed, because I wanted, for the reasons I gave previously, I wanted to wait to see their list and then raise discrepancies. Because I didn't want to give them an excuse to say that somebody who wasn't on our list, they might conceivably hold back. But afterwards, I took the 80 names that we had, that we considered discrepancies, to Hanoi on February 11th, which was 10 days after we received the Laotian list. And I brought with me the folders of 19 on whom we thought we had particularly good information.
So they presented their list first?
They presented their list on January 27th, yes. I had no basis to raise discrepancies until I had their list.
How were our lists prepared? Did the Department of Defense?
I think the Defense Department would know it better than I did. We got some lists. There was one list that Senator Kennedy, they never gave us official lists. They gave lists to people that they wanted to influence or to sympathizers.
I mean our lists.
No, our list was composed of several elements. One, the lists we got indirectly that they gave to somebody, like peace activists, and they once gave a list of 360 plus names to Senator Kennedy, and he very appropriately gave them to us. We had other information. Then there were the letters to which Secretary Laird referred yesterday. I think that figure of 5,000 letters seems very high to me, but that was entirely in his department, and they would be able to check that. But they were putting it together from intelligence reports, from voice contact with people they had on the ground. That is how our list was prepared. But Admiral Moore, when he testifies, will be able to do that, give it to you in more detail.
Well, I've, in questioning some earlier witnesses, it has been a little hard for me to understand, because there seems to be some divergent views on exactly how these lists were put together.
My office had nothing to do with preparing the list. We would accept what the experts would give us and not challenge it.
That's why I was asking you sort of where it came from, if you knew the intelligence committees.
We generally got it from the Defense Department and the Joint Chiefs. And if I'm not, and then the State Department usually did the negotiating about it.
In these negotiations regarding the lists, was there any consideration taken to whether there might be any in the Soviet Union at that time, any prisoners of war taken to the Soviet Union?
You know, one of the unsettling things to me about seeing all these documents is that things appear that I might easily have sworn to never happened. I do not recall any such conversation, and we would have reacted so neuralgically that I don't believe that I would have forgotten that. I mean, if we had had any suspicion, with all the contacts we had with the Soviet Union, they would never have heard the end of it.
Well, that's true, but they might not have been forthcoming about it.
They mightn't have been forthcoming, but I don't believe we ever raised it with them, and that I know we never raised it with them, and that has to be because no one ever alleged it.
The Vietnamese at that, one other thing I guess that puzzles me, because you've gone into great detail, and we've heard great detail about the Vietnamese and these lists and other hearings. Why would they not have, what advantage to them would it not have, to not be more forthcoming? why were they reluctant to give a full accounting? What advantage would it have been to them?
Well, you know, why would they keep bones in morgues or wherever they keep them and dole them out to us 2 or 3 a year, which I find incredibly offensive, that every time they need to make a move, they bring us a few bones of American servicemen who were killed there. Fundamentally, I would have to say I can find no rational reason for them to hold prisoners, and one has to be fair that the terrain is so difficult that people might have hit the ground, and I'm just speculating, I have no knowledge whatever. It is possible that people reached the ground and had voice contact and then died of exposure or were beaten to death by local people, or it is possible that people were killed under conditions that the North Vietnamese were not eager to acknowledge. And some of it may have been just cussedness. I cannot find a good rationale.
There have been some that have said, as you know, that they were holding it for bargaining purposes and seeking payment.
Yes, but they never have actually bargained with them, and there were people who have gone there who had suggested it to them and who have even suggested to them, why don't you say they were in Laos or something, and they've never done it. They're capable of it. If a year or two later they had said, we've just found 50 and we want X billion dollars for it, I would have been totally outraged and not surprised. I mean, that's... but why they would hold prisoners that they don't acknowledge, for that I have great difficulty understanding it.
Well, given your understanding and years of dealing with them, what, and this follows on Senator Kerry asked too, what really should we be doing now to get an accounting? They have, in the trips that Senator Smith and Kerry have made to Vietnam, been somewhat more forthcoming, and documents have been opened to the committee by the Vietnamese, but still there's some real gaps there.
Well, as I said earlier, Senator, I do not usually participate in the debate on Vietnam because I'm so bruised by it that I may not have a rational view. My instinct would be that I would not give them diplomatic recognition, I would not give them any economic assistance or any economic cooperation until they give us access to the areas where we now have intelligence and let us make a good faith search and check on whatever information we have. I don't see why that should be beyond them. And after that, I would let normal relations take their course. But that is something they owe us.
Well, it is...
And I think they have enough influence in Laos to bring that about there, too. I would apply the same to Laos.
Well, yes, I think that goes without saying, and clearly there was very little effort even made to... while the Vietnamese promised that they would be responsible, nothing was ever really presented that was a clear understanding of the situation in Laos. Would you say that's correct? Other than
from the documents that Senator Kerry brought out, I think it's clear that the understanding about Laos, there's no evidence that they seem to break signed and unsigned agreements with equal alacrity. The problem in Laos was that our judgment was that the Party Lao, as many reports indicated, were total subordinate stooges of them. And we rather had Vietnam responsible for it than people with whom we had practically no contact. And we thought that after a Laotian agreement was reached, we could then deal with the Laotian parties a lot more easily. But I feel that we should insist in any dealings with the Laotian government and with Hanoi that we want access to the regions in which there's so much concern.
From the perspective of today, it seems a shame that we didn't really pursue more aggressively the situation and help provide families with some answers, say even 75, 76, 78, 79, while there would have been some opportunities there, perhaps to...
Look, I feel, even where I am in Connecticut, on weekends I've been meeting, I met in the 80s with families of the missing in action up there. I'm totally out of government. And they gave me some information which I then took up with General Vesey. So the families of the missing in action deserve our fullest compassion, understanding, and support.
Yes, they certainly do, and have kept the issue alive. And what's really very sad to me, as I've observed these committees and hearings and the situation, are those who have taken advantage of the emotions in some instances of families, because it's an easy thing to do when you're struggling to find some answers. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you very much, Senator Kasselbaum. Senator Kissinger, Senator Dr. Kissinger, we're right on the button here at 1:15, and we will recess now until 2:30 and look forward to resuming. Thank you very much. I'll do a little thing. We'll see.
That concludes the morning session of Tuesday's meeting of the Senate Select Committee on POW and MIA Affairs. The membership has taken a lunch recess, and we will pause now to take a short break and to pass on some schedule information.
Yes, sir. You ready?
C-SPAN, the cable satellite public affairs network, and its companion network, C-SPAN 2, are privately funded to serve the public by America's cable television companies.
Here is a brief look at the program schedule ahead, and please note that all listed times are Eastern only. Next, we continue with our coverage of the second of 3 days of hearings conducted by the Senate Select Committee on POW and MIA affairs. The committee is looking into the priority given to POWs and MIAs during the 1973 peace talks with the North Vietnamese government. At the witness table, former Secretary of State and National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger. After that, it's two events from the campaign trail. Both were recorded yesterday. First, Democratic presidential nominee Bill Clinton participates in a town hall-style meeting from the studios of a Detroit television station. Then Rich Bond, the chairman of the Republican National Committee, holds a news conference in East Lansing, Michigan, to talk about the record of the Arkansas governor. And later this morning at 7:30, it's News One from Moscow, the Russian evening newscast.
Short subject. C-SPAN's 10-minute educational videos are now seen every Monday morning at 6:45 a.m. Works in the nation's schools. Coming next, we take you to Capitol Hill for the afternoon portion of Tuesday's meeting of the Senate Select Committee on POW and MIA Affairs. Henry Kissinger, Secretary of State for President Nixon at the time and the man who negotiated the 1973 Paris Peace Accord with Vietnam, is the sole witness. Dr. Kissinger is discussing the closing chapters of America's involvement in Vietnam. The committee is examining whether he or other Nixon administration officials pressed the North Vietnamese sufficiently into returning all American POWs. We take you now to the Hart Senate Office Building, where Senator John Kerry of Massachusetts will gavel in the proceedings.
The hearing will come back to order. Mr. Secretary, my apologies. As you know, we had a brief meeting in the back room there, and I appreciate your patience very much. Senator Daschle was the next to question per the order in the morning, so I'll turn right to him. Senator Daschle.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Dr. Kissinger, I appreciate very much your sharing your insights with us as you have already today. I think a lot of the concern has revolved around the lack of consistent information, the information provided from various witnesses as well as documents, and I think that's really the effort we're attempting to make here is to try to clarify and even correct, if possible, the inconsistencies that exist. One inconsistency has to do with the announcement that we had not made any secret agreements with regard to the Vietnamese or others. On January 24th of '73, you held a news conference to explain the text of agreements to reporters, and you stated that in reference to the return of U.S. POWs, quote, "We've been told that no American prisoners are held in Cambodia. American prisoners held in Laos and North Vietnam will be returned to us in Hanoi. That all American prisoners will, of course, be released within 60 days," I'm still quoting, "of the signing of the agreement, and the signing will take place on January 27th. You stated that the return of the American personnel and the accounting for the missing in action is, quote, unconditional. Although Laos was not a signatory to the Paris Accords, you stated that you firmly expected there would be a formal ceasefire in Laos in a short period of time. And in response to a question regarding the existence of any secret understandings, you said there are no secret understandings. Could you clarify what appears to be a contradiction?
I remember what we I'm practically, what did we do about these understandings? I think what we did, Senator, I really don't remember exactly. I think what we did was to give their substance without publishing their text.
I'm not sure I understand.
I think what you have just read is the substance of the understanding we had with Hanoi. And this is why I said we firmly expect this to happen. And I think this is the way it was handled.
I'm not sure I understand, and you'll have to excuse me,
No, the
impression I
understanding
have is that
we had been assured by the Vietnamese that there would be a, which is written down. We had. You see, but I just don't remember whether these understandings were made public at the time and whether this refers to additional secret understandings.
Well, you were asked if there were any secret agreements, and you said there are no secret understandings. As a matter of fact, then you went on to say that
what this
it is in the sense of secret commitments. But there were statements by each side of its intentions or interpretation of the agreement on which the other side might or might not choose to rely. But then just within a week, there was an affirmation of what has been understood now to be the secret negotiations and commitments made by both sides with regard to Article 21 of the Paris Accords and the procedures implementing Article 21, especially having to do with reconstruction.
No. Oh, that's a different issue. That I can explain easily. I thought you were talking about the ceasefire arrangements for Laos. The Article 21, we had the following problem. We did not want to create the impression of ransom and reparations. We also felt from a moral point of view it was important that aid for Vietnam be in the context of a voluntary act by the United States to heal what we call to heal the wounds of war. We had stated publicly, President Johnson had stated in 1965, President Nixon had stated at least twice in 1972, our intention to give economic aid, and in February 1972, President Nixon had even given a figure of 2.5 billion, which was somewhat low. We, however, did not want to have happen what has happened here, which I'm not saying is a criticism, of having the Vietnamese raise the issue of either ransom or reparations as a formal aspect of the agreement. So therefore, we said we would write them a letter which indicated the magnitude of what we would consider intend to put before the Congress, making clear, however, that the implementation of it would depend on the constitutional procedures, and we even gave them a paper on the constitutional procedures by which this would be implemented, which made it clear that we had no authority to make such a commitment, which then, when I came to Hanoi, led to rather acrimonious exchanges, which I'm sure Mr. Codina has.
But was not the statement
He's the unsung star of these hearings, isn't he?
I beg your pardon? He's the star of the hearing, yeah.
This one here?
But even given that explanation, it would appear to me that the statement of January 24th, that there was no secret understanding, it stands in conflict with the truth.
Well, we considered this a unilateral statement which we were making. We phrased it entirely in these terms. We never made any secret of the attempt that we intended to give economic aid. We created an economic commission which we publicly announced. I'm sure we can find many press conference statements in which, I'm sure it's in this press conference, in which I indicate that we intend to give economic aid. The major concern we had was to keep them from claiming it was a legal obligation to them, to the Vietnamese.
Were there not any informal agreements? You make reference to the fact formal or informal. There were no informal agreements prior to January 24th with regard to reconstruction assistance or any other matters dealing with Article 21?
To the best of my recollection now, the question of economic aid was discussed at the end or at the conclusion of the other agreement, certainly before January 24th. I don't know exactly, but in the latest stages of the discussions, and the most serious debate concerned the procedures we would follow, and we were insistent on not making it part of the agreement, but making it part of a unilateral offer by the president, which would then be followed by extended discussions, which would then be followed by constitutional procedures in the United States.
Well, I may want to follow up on that some more, but I had some other areas that I wanted to pursue with regard to your interpretation. You mentioned in your statement on page 6 that we demanded and obtained North Vietnamese promises to release all American prisoners and to assist in accounting of our MIAs throughout Indochina, despite initial insistence by Hanoi that it would negotiate only about prisoners in Vietnam. What is your interpretation of the difference between an accounting of POWs and actual release of prisoners who might have been held there?
The difference is that identified prisoners had to be released. Accounting concerned those about whose fate we did not know, that were neither prisoners nor confirmed dead. And in those categories, we would insist on an accounting.
Well, if all you were going to do is to insist upon an accounting, how was it that you hoped to retrieve those who may still be held in Laos?
Oh, well, Senator, obviously, once they moved from the missing stage to the confirmed prisoner stage, they would be covered by the obligation to return all prisoners.
Who would? The North Vietnamese would?
Not the North
Vietnamese by the agreement or the protocol. They were not. That was one question I wanted to ask as to why it was we didn't hold them to not just an accounting, but some return of people held in Laos.
No. The North Vietnamese told us that all prisoners held in Laos, they told us this in writing, would be returned. The number was unknown at the time that they made this statement, so as soon as we had confirmation that they were missing, that showed up, that we at first carried as missing, that showed up as prisoners, you can bet your life we would have held them to the provision that they had to return the prisoners.
But my point is that there was no requirement for an accounting of people in Laos.
No, I read you this morning these interlocking cables in which the Vietnamese said that the provisions with respect to missing that are in the Vietnam agreement would also be applied to Laos and Cambodia.
Well, why, if we had provisions like that, were they not written into the agreement or the protocol?
Because the problem, both sides had a problem there. The Vietnamese, for a variety of reasons, which I'm sure were not to our benefit, wanted to separate Cambodia and Laos from Vietnam. But we had a similar reason, because we did not want to establish the principle that Vietnam had a right of permanent intervention in Laos and Cambodia, since the domination of Laos and Cambodia was one of the matters we had been trying to prevent all along. So it seemed to us that this solution that was adopted was the best to meet our concerns.
You made reference this morning to the information that you had available to you with regard to numbers and names of people who may have been left in Laos. Secretary Laird...
wait a minute, Senator. I did not have that information. I had information about, don't hold me to the number, roughly 80 people that about there were discrepancies, some of which the chairman has mentioned. And some were in Vietnam and some were in Laos. They were not all in Laos.
Well, I concede that point. There were some in Laos. You do not
yes, that's correct.
Challenge that. And this information, as I understand it, was provided to you from the Department of Defense and other sources?
It was provided only from the Department of Defense right after the lists became available in the first week of February 1973, and I took it up in Hanoi on February 11th, 10th and 11th of 1973.
So that was the first time you'd ever received information regarding names or numbers of people in Laos, regardless of what you may have received from Vietnam?
I had received information about people in Laos at various times. The figure that I recall off the top of my head now that I received at the end of January 1973 was that there could be as many as 40 prisoners in Laos. That seemed to be the Defense Department estimate at the time.
This was in January of 73.
That was in January 73. Before that, you have to understand the division of responsibilities in the government on this matter. The security advisor has to deal with every, or at least in those days, and I think still had to deal with every item dealing with the field of foreign policy and intelligence that came to the president. So I did not have a staff to go into the details of the prisoners. The way it worked was that when any matter requiring presidential attention concerning prisoners was raised, I would get a briefing from the Defense Department or from the Joint Chiefs as to the numbers. Secondly, Secretary Laird had taken a very special and very passionate interest in the prisoners, so he kept in frequent contact about it, but we did not make ourselves responsible in the White House for detailed listing of prisoners. We relied on the agencies to supply those.
But you had no reason to believe that the information you were being provided was not complete or accurate, that was the best information.
No, I had no reason to doubt the information, and I didn't doubt it.
Well, given the fact that upon the signing of the accords and the information and the release of the prisoners that were released, that none were released from Laos. You had mentioned this morning that in your heart of hearts, you felt that there may have been some in Laos. Was that a correct interpretation of your comment
it's not correct to say that none were released from Laos. I believe there were 9 or 10 on the list from Laos.
There were.
And they were in due course released. That is to say, they were released in the last tranche of the releases.
But we had a list of at least 40 and 10 were released.
I don't think we had a list of 40, Senator. You'd have to ask the responsible Defense Department officials. I believe what they did is to make an extrapolation on the basis of the percentages of what we received in North and South Vietnam and took a guess at what they thought was a reasonable figure, extrapolating this to Laos. They did not give me a list of the 40 that they thought were there.
To what extent did you...
Besides, that number was given to me before we had the North Vietnam, before we had the Laotian list, so I had no basis to make any judgment.
Well, regardless of how you interpreted the lists or relied upon them, could you expound upon your feelings towards what may remain in Laos? What in 74, after all of these negotiations?
You mean today or then?
Today, that's right.
Today?
What do you view the circumstances to be in 74 and today with regard to the information we have concerning POWs in Laos?
Actually, Senator, I don't want to be nitpicking. You're talking about 73.
73.
It's in 73 that these lists.
Correct.
It makes no difference to the case.
Well, I said 74 because January of 73 is when the accord, but it was in the following months that efforts were made to bring prisoners home.
But the most anguishing problems arose, Senator, in the first 6 months of 1973, because that's when it became apparent.
Exactly.
I had hoped that perhaps after all this anguish of the war and after not achieving their full objectives, the Vietnamese, there might be a period in which they would turn to the reconstruction of their country and improving relations with the outside world. And if you look at the concluding statements that Lee Duc-Tho and I made off the top of our heads after a 20-hour negotiating session, you will see that that was a dominant theme. So I did not exclude that this might happen, unfortunately. And in fact, when I went to Hanoi in February, that was one of my hopes. I remember one of the newsmen accompanying me on the plane said, what you're really hoping for is that Pham Van Dong, who was then Prime Minister of Hanoi, would turn out to be a Zhou Enlai. And I said, that's right, that's what I would like to see happen. That did not happen. it became very rapidly apparent that we did not receive an adequate accounting on the missing in action. In the first few weeks, you could not be sure what the reason was, because they had just been heavily bombed. It was a chaotic situation in their country, but then massive infiltration started in the south, and it was clear that they were preparing for another showdown, and that they were not even going through the motions of giving us an adequate accounting for the missing in action. That was a very, very painful thing for me, having met with the families quite regularly during that period, and feeling a considerable sense of responsibility. I believe that I came to the view by the middle of March, and remember, that's only 4 weeks after I'd been in Hanoi. I came to the view that we had to resume military operations if we were going to get a reasonable reaction from Hanoi. And the strategy that I preferred was that we would resume bombing, resume military operations towards the end of March. I actually wanted to do it before the last tranche of prisoners came back, and that we would then request a meeting with Lee Dak-to and go through the whole agreement and get it enforced. As I pointed out, President Nixon, for very good reasons, decided not to do this. He wanted to get those 160 people back that we were owed on March 28th. And if I had been in his position, I would have done exactly the same thing. It was one thing for me as an advisor to do this. Then, as the course of April, we started technical discussions on all these issues, including the POWs, and then there were the negotiations in May. If I could just add one sentence, the chairman, when he and I exchanged impressions about that negotiation, said all you wanted was one sentence, and he was right. That's all I wanted. I wanted one sentence to be put in a communique, because the strategy was that once they had an obligation, we would then enforce it with military operations if they didn't carry it out. It isn't all I wanted in life. It is all I wanted at that stage.
But you had concluded at some point in 1973, following all of this, that our efforts to retrieve MIAs and perhaps even POWs in Laos was unsuccessful. Is that a correct statement?
Correct. That they weren't carrying out the agreement.
So we knew by the end of 1973 that because our efforts were unsuccessful, that there may be people still in Laos.
Yes, maybe it's, and this is all. I always said this to the families of the. You have records of this. Whenever I spoke to families, whenever I spoke to the press, that's what I said.
The last question.
I never said they're all dead.
Why were you unable to get the International Red Cross to inspect locations where we suspected Americans were being held?
I tell you, you've never dealt with these people, Senator. We would have been thrilled if they had let the International Red Cross come in. They weren't going to have it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Grassley. Yes.
I can just tell you, if I may be anecdotal for a moment, what it was like to negotiate with Lee Dak-to. I once wanted to take a break in the negotiations, and I thought I would phrase it in Marxist terminology. So I said, Mr. Special Advisor, could we take a brief break because objective necessity requires it, which is a Marxist phrase. I was kept in the room for another half hour being given a lecture why I had no right to use Marxist terminology. So
they were hoping you were going to explode on the spot.
So all I'm saying, these were not choir boys to deal with.
Senator Grassley.
Unlike the Senate.
Yes.
Dr. Kissinger, I've had an opportunity to hear your statement about the lack of hard evidence about prisoners being left behind, and I want to kind of lead you away from the question of hard evidence for a moment. I suppose I want to lead you away from the issue of hard evidence for a moment. And I do this because, unlike my colleagues, I'm not a lawyer, I'm a farmer. You're a great statesman and a professor, and you're also a great negotiator. And speak in terms of what your gut feel is. Yesterday, we heard, and hopefully you heard, Secretaries Laird and Schlesinger say that they believe that we left men behind. And as you sit here today, and it is 1992, and it's 20 years advantage of hindsight, plus, of course, you were in the loop so very intimately back then. What is your gut feel for whether or not the Vietnamese or the Lao withheld prisoners from us?
I've already said this morning, Senator, but I just want to repeat it. Secretary Schlesinger, who was my colleague and close associate for many years, said that his present judgment is that they were left behind. At the time, he was CIA director, and then he was Secretary of Defense, so in a sense these were his people. He did not write one memorandum, one telephone call, one meeting where he made that statement. So therefore, as far as we were concerned, we did not have the benefit of the information that the committee had yesterday. And I do not remember Secretary Schlesinger being very shy about expressing his views. Now you're asking me, I just want to make clear that we didn't ignore what they thought. Secretary Laird, I am given to understand, has said his view is roughly the same as mine, that we did not know whether they were there. Now, what is my present gut feeling?
Yeah, that's right. Based upon 20 years of hindsight.
My present gut feeling is that probably no prisoners were left behind in Vietnam. Possibly some prisoners were left behind, were kept behind in Laos, which has been my feeling more or less since the middle 70s. But I'm not dogmatic about this. I'm perfectly willing to change my mind on the proposition. I have not been able to figure out a reason why they would keep the prisoners. But anyone who produces evidence will have my strong support.
Well, I think that right there is a very significant statement that you just made. Let me go on and refer to May 6th. You were on the Larry King live show, and you were asked if you thought prisoners were left behind, and here was your response. Quote, "Well, I think it is possible that, I have no evidence of it, but I do not exclude the fact that in Laos there were things, where things were not well organized, that prisoners were held back in violation of the agreement. And if we ever have any evidence of this, I would be in favor of taking extremely strong action. I cannot see a rationale why they should hold back POWs. They don't do them any good unless they negotiate for them. But then I have to say that I have never dealt with a group of people as treacherous as the North Vietnamese leadership. They would stop at nothing to achieve their objectives." End of quote. Secretary Schlesinger stated it this way. He said on the question of leaving prisoners behind, his probability assessment for Laos was high. His probability assessment for Vietnam was medium. So what I'd like to have is your probability of assessment about the question of us leaving prisoners behind in each Laos and Vietnam.
I can only repeat Secretary Schlesinger's operational opinion mattered then. Today it's a historical reflection. What is my present assessment? I'd hate to give it such a figure. I consider the possibility low in Vietnam and somewhat higher in Laos.
Okay. You have said that the North Vietnamese were...
But I want to make clear they were left, if so, they were kept in violation of the agreement in total ignorance of the American government.
Okay. You have said that the North Vietnamese were treacherous and would stop at nothing to achieve their objectives. This treachery, I think, it's fair to say, has been previously revealed in what we discussed yesterday and maybe some reference today about the so-called French experience after Dien Bien Phu. Yesterday, General Walters gave us testimony about what he learned from the G2 of the French Army about the French experience. The lessons learned from this experience should have been a prerequisite for negotiating with the North Vietnamese. I'd like to read, if I could, from General Walters' deposition about what he describes he learned about this French experience, and then who he shared it with, and then I'd like to read from your deposition, and then I have a question. First of all, from Walters' deposition. Question. You were talking about information that you received at some point about a small percentage of known French prisoners of war who were actually returned by Vietnam. Can you tell us again, what, to the best of your memory, what the information was that you received on the subject? Answer. Something like half the prisoners that were known to have been captured alive never came back to France after they reached a deal with the North Vietnamese. Next question. After they reached a deal that all prisoners would be released. Answer. That's correct. Next question. These were prisoners who, through some intelligence source, were known to be alive. Answer. They had surrendered at Dien Bien Phu. A large number of them had surrendered at Dien Bien Phu. Then skipping a little ways, another question. Who was the person who gave you this information? Answer. Well, the G2 of the French Army. And question. You received this information. Do you remember when it was? Answer. No. But it was sometime. Question. But it was sometime that you were defense attaché. Answer. Quite early. Question. And the understanding was that the approximately half of the known POWs who were not returned. Answer. An enormously high percentage of known POWs had not come back. Question. But the understanding with this French experience was that. Answer. They would all be delivered back. Question. Was the understanding of this officer who told you about the half or more than half who did not get returned, was it that those people had been killed, or was it that those people had been held as prisoners afterwards? Answer. He presumed they had been killed. Question. When you learned this information, did you give it to anyone else in the United States government? Answer. Yes, I reported it to the DIA. Question. Did you ever have a discussion with Dr. Kissinger about this information that you had about French POWs? Answer. Yes. Question. So there's no question in your mind? Answer. His reaction, as I remember it, was, well, they probably won't kill ours because they want more from us than they do from the French. The French, all they wanted was the French to leave. From us, they wanted help to reconstruct. So he was somewhat more optimistic in the case of ours. And then from your deposition, question. Were you familiar with the so-called French experience that the French had suffered after Dien Bien Phu in the 50s, after the defeat of Dien Bien Phu? Answer, in a general way. Question, are you familiar with the problems that the French had had in making the Vietnamese account for the soldiers that they lost? Answer, I said in a general way. Question, do you recall Vernon Walters discussing this subject with you, what the French experience had been after the 1954 defeat at Dien Bien Phu? Answer, I don't remember it specifically, no. Question, if Vernon Walters had told you that the French had had a problem in accounting with the Vietnamese after the war, would that have made a difference in your negotiations as it applied to the list? Answer, I don't know. Since he didn't discuss it, I can't say. Question, you have no recollection of this discussion? Answer, I have no recollection of this discussion. Now to the point that I want you to ask, what General Walters learned about the French experience obviously made a lasting impression on him. The import of this experience is its direct bearing on the negotiations regarding the list. the record is not yet clear as to whether an understanding of the French experience made as lasting an impression on you, Dr. Kissinger, as it obviously did on General Walters. And so I'd like to have you clarify that, but also let me repeat the question that was asked in the deposition. If Vernon Walters had told you that the French had had a problem in the accounting with the Vietnamese after their war, would that have made a difference in your negotiations as it applied to the lists?
As I said in my deposition, I have no recollection of that conversation with General Walters. On the other hand, I have the highest regard for General Walters, and I don't question his recollection. On the other hand, I knew from other sources that the French had had trouble. I've read books about Dien Bien Phu. The real question you're raising, Senator, is were we too trusting in drafting the agreements? And if we had drafted other agreements, would we have received a better accounting? And to that, the answer is emphatically no. I believe we drafted the best agreements that were possible. The Montgomery Committee also came to that conclusion, and we achieved the best agreement that I believe was possible, and I would be interested, just as a historian, to know what provision you think we could have put in that would have improved it. The lacking component was not the statement of obligations. The statement of obligations was perfectly plain. The lacking component was the ability to enforce the agreement. And I read this morning a message I sent to President Nixon before the agreement was signed, which I can perhaps just read you the operative paragraph again, in which I said we can anticipate no lasting peace in the wake of a consummated agreement, but merely a shift in Hanoi's modus operandi. We will probably have little chance of maintaining the agreement without evident hair-trigger U.S. readiness, which may be in fact challenged at any time to enforce the provisions. That was my basic view then, and it's my basic view now. It did not matter whether we could have added one or another clause to the agreement. The provisions with respect to the missing in action were perfectly plain. They just didn't carry them out.
Well, let me apologize if that need be. I'm not here to say I could do a better job. I could not have done a better job. I'm only here to get whatever information we can of the process at that time, at the thought process at that time. Is it plausible, in your mind, that the Vietnamese held back prisoners, either in Vietnam or Laos, expecting to receive reparations? I mean, if reparations were their primary concern, and if we didn't give it to them, and then you consider the lesson of the French experience, isn't it logical that the North Vietnamese would have held back some of our men until they got their reparations?
Senator, until 1976, they never made that claim, and they needed a lot of hinting from Americans before they even said this. I don't believe that reparations were their primary objective. Their primary objective was to take over Indochina. And if all they had wanted from us was economic aid, all they would have had to do is observe the agreement, and we would have certainly put it to the Congress.
I would only refer once again to impression that General Walters had, and he was present and intimately involved in a lot of the discussion that was going on.
Correct.
It was his impression that they were tied together, and he from another pages from the deposition, question of General Walters, and what would the priorities be on the North Vietnamese side from the cables and from the discussion that they had at the meetings? Answer: what's in it for us if we do? What will you promise us as reparations for the harm you have done us? And of course, Kissinger would always bridle at that question. So North Vietnamese had then brought up the reconstruction aid fairly early in the talks? The answer is yes. Question. The North Vietnamese kept raising the reconstruction aid often. Answer. Obviously, they did not want to appear to be pleading or begging, but they raised it, yes, as though it was their right and due considering the terrible damages that we had done to their country. During the time you were in the negotiations with the North Vietnamese, with Dr. Kissinger, do you recall him ever seeking your input as military general as to the POW issue specifically? No, I recall his saying that once they, the North Vietnamese, think that this is a golden trump. They know how badly we want POWs back, and they're going to play it for all it's worth, and I agree. Question. Was there ever any effort by the North Vietnamese that you were aware of to link the subject of our payment of reparations to them with their release of prisoners? Answer. Reparations were a sine qua non for peace. Return the prisoners for everything. Question. From the North Vietnamese perspective, you mean? Answer, yes. So there was no question that Dr. Kissinger was aware of the North Vietnamese desire to link reparations with the release of U.S. prisoners. Answer, not in my mind. Question. And you say that because you saw Dr. Kissinger discussing this subject with the North Vietnamese? Answer, I was translating.
Well, Senator Smith brought out already this morning a statement from Ambassador Habib, which I confirmed. There's no doubt that the Vietnamese welcomed or desired some reparation. Again, I must say, the chairman calls Mr. Codina the star of this show. Noticed he smiled when you read the word bridle, because it showed him that I was not discriminating against him, that I can bridle also at foreigners. I think you have the records, and I believe you will find from the records, which we're talking about events that happened 20 years ago. I think you will find that the issue of reparation, first of all, that I consistently rejected and violently rejected the word reparations. And Walter says it. Secondly, I think you will find that if you look at the record, that the issue of economic aid arose only late in the negotiations after the principles of other issues had already been settled. But I won't swear to that. You have the record, so it's very easy to determine. And that from that, it is easy to determine the relative priority that was given to this. My recollection is not the one of General Walters, who was, after all, doing it from memory in 20 years.
The ubiquitous Mr. Codina tells me that it was 1971 it was first discussed.
It was first discussed, but not in detail. It was the sequence of events was as follows. In 1970, there were always groups of negotiations because it always centered around Lee Duc-Tho being in Paris. In the first group of negotiations in 1970, it was essentially psychological warfare by the Vietnamese, trying to tell us that they'd break us down, and we never got to any concrete issues. We proposed the neutralization of Cambodia, which they rejected, but it never got to any point. Then there was a second group of negotiations that started in May 1971 and went until November, but really only through August, but let's say they terminated in November, in which we for the first time had actual points. And in those negotiations, I believe, I don't know whether it was a specific point. My instinct is that I would probably have mentioned it separately to the points that we were raising, but it is true we were introducing it at the time. I do not remember that the Vietnamese responded at that point and that it led to a negotiation on that issue. We settled about 5 of the 7 points, but we could not settle the issue of the future of the government of Vietnam and the timing of American withdrawal.
Mr.
Senator
Chair,
Robb, yes, Senator.
I'm done with my question. I know my time's out. I just would say that I believe that it is plausible that there was this relationship, and I think that we ought to take him up on his suggestion of reviewing the record and see just exactly the relationship and establish it, because I think it is very plausible.
I think the record, staff, that will be done. Staff is already doing it. You know, I think that we can get a little bit lost if we go back into all of that. But it might have some impact on accountability, and obviously we ought to examine it. Senator Robb.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Kissinger, thank you for your patience today. It's been a long day, and Senator Brown and I, who are batting in the last two positions, assume we might have more time than I think your schedule probably allows at this point. So, Senator Brown, I want you to know that I
can stay till a little after 4:30.
All right. Well, we won't truncate our questions quite as much as we might have otherwise.
You shouldn't have said that.
Yeah, I was going to say that's a dangerous thing.
That's a mistake.
Senator Cole will be coming back too, so we do, and I think there are a couple of follow-up questions from Chair and Vice Chair. So if we could.
And I understand
just move along.
There's a vote starting, so you may be saved by an entirely different bell. In any event, if I may, Mr. Secretary, I'd like to focus just a minute on the relationship as you perceived it at the time between the North Vietnamese and the Pathet Lao. That, of course, has been the focus of a number of the questions and certainly a lot of the focus here. And we have fairly extensive records on behalf of the North Vietnamese and a good track record both in terms of our relationships and what have you. We have very little track record, very few records available that relate to the situation in Laos at all. I wondered if you could first simply address the question of the relationship between those two governments at the entities at the time that you were engaged in the negotiations, and how much ability that we had to track what was actually happening in Laos with respect to any of the intelligence coming from that area.
Our perception of the Pathet Lao was that they were stooges of Hanoi, that they had no independence whatsoever, that they were totally controlled by the communists in Hanoi. I do not have a precise grasp now of the intelligence we had, except that intelligence was harder to get in that area because of the difficulty of geography than it was in Vietnam, not that it was easy to get in Vietnam. So generally we were dealing there with an area less well known to us, with people with whom we had next to no contact, and who were perceived by our ambassador in Laos, by all our ambassadors in Laos, to be total tools of Hanoi.
I would observe parenthetically, having, to the best of my knowledge, visited Laos for the first time this year with the delegation when we went over, and I made a brief trip to Vientiane and flew over some of the area, which was different. I say acknowledged for the first time because operating in the Quang Nam province and over toward the western border, if the maps weren't correct, you never know exactly where you might have been at any given time. In any event, the difficulty of both communication and the normal government functions is apparent to anyone who has seen that area and understands the relationships between the central government, to the extent that exists today, and some of the provisional or tribal governments that are in the area, is the reason I asked the question.
Incidentally, our view of the Pathet Lao was also shared by the two non-communist groups in the Laotian government, Savannah Phouma, who was at that time Prime Minister, and the right-wing group.
I believe it was in 1972 that you cabled General Haig to the effect that it was still a major concern or major provision that you were not able to include in the formal agreement, at least up to that point, the provisions for the Laotian prisoners to the extent that they existed, or Cambodia at that particular time, and yet subsequently, as you've indicated, you were required to accept a side agreement, I think is...
Could you give us the date?
Well, it isn't critical except to suggest that it was regarded on the basis of a cable. Let me see if I've got it here in my notes. I think it was September 27th, 1972, if that's helpful. I cite it only for the point that it was presumed to be a significant issue, and yet ultimately, for reasons that you stated a few minutes ago in answer to Senator Daschle's question, I think it was, accepted the side understanding, or side understanding, I guess is the way it was referred to. And yet the question I'm actually asking at this point is whether or not that was ever formally ratified even by the government as you described them, or whether you had any reason to believe that they participated in that decision, or whether that was largely dictated entirely by the North Vietnamese at that particular moment, whether they had any direct knowledge of what was happening in Laos.
First, I'll answer that in a second. I want to make clear that, in my judgment, the enforceability of the agreement had nothing to do with whether it was part of the main agreement or part of an associated agreement. The enforceability had entirely to do with the penalties or rewards that Hanoi would receive for carrying out the agreement. Now, what was the second part of the question? Did we consider it a considerable? Yes. We considered it a significant achievement that they agreed to release prisoners and account for the missing throughout Indochina. But I still have the uneasy feeling that I don't remember your last question, which
well, it related to whether or not this was a knowledgeable transaction entered into by two
what
parties.
What was the relation of the Padre Lao? You see, we were dealing, we had every confidence that Hanoi could make the Padre Lao do what they wanted. Now, did they check with the Padre Lao and the Padre Lao debated with them, or did they not? This I cannot tell you. But we were confident, and we had never seen an example to the contrary, that the Padre Lao would disobey anything that Hanoi wanted them to do. Now, we looked at this from 2 points of view. One, if the issue was a Padre Lao, remained a Padre Lao issue, we rather dealt with Hanoi than with the Padre Lao because we had very little leverage on the Padre Lao. If, by chance, it turned out that the agreement on Laos would be carried out, that is to say that the ceasefire would be honored, that the North Vietnamese would remove from Laos, all of which was required of them, that a genuine coalition government would be formed, then we were going to deal with the government in Vientiane for whatever it was that Hanoi hadn't delivered. And we had every confidence that from the government in Vientiane we would have almost unlimited cooperation in getting access to that part of the country. And when you look at the record, you will see that an agreement was signed between the Laotian parties on February 21st, 1973, or thereabouts, which was part of the basic understandings, and that immediately we instructed Ambassador Godley to establish contact with the Padre Lao, who would then, in our perception, perhaps have moved into the central government to take up any issue that was left from the Vietnam Agreement. This was our perception of how it would work.
But you basically held the North Vietnamese responsible and indeed communicated with them about everything, and so that any information that would have originated presumably in the Pathet Lao would have been passed through and indeed given any credibility that you attached to it by the North Vietnamese, not independently from the Pathet Lao.
Absolutely correct, Senator.
Okay. Let me just one other question with respect to on this particular topic. There were a total of 10 prisoners, as you've previously indicated, that were returned. 9 of them relevant here. There was a communication somewhere along the line, I can't cite it at the moment, but indicating that a DIA analysis of those prisoners indicated that they were in fact captured by the North Vietnamese in Laotian territory, whatever the case may be, which, if that's true, would mean that we, during the repatriation, received no prisoners, MIAs, back from any territory that was actually under the operational control of the Pathet Lao or anybody that presumed to represent that entity. Is that a fair characterization, first of all?
If that is correct, and I also saw this DIA report, and I have no reason to believe it isn't correct, then we never received any prisoner that was captured by the Padilao, and they might easily have done what the Khmer Rouge did. Kill every prisoner.
Yeah, I got the distinct impression, I won't prolong this at this point, in talking to a number of the officials in Vientiane and elsewhere, that they do not exclude that possibility, but don't have anything that would give them records to substantiate anything that might have happened. They can only say that, in effect, we didn't think we were principal participants in the war, and every day this huge tonnage of bombs falls on us. We're not favorably disposed toward any of your downed aviators or whatever, and in fact we don't have control, and the tribes or villagers that would take their own justice at that particular moment. Let me just switch, if I may, because the vote is on and we've got the 5 bells, which means...
May I, Senator, there's a letter in today's New York Post in reply to an Evans and Novak column last week, in which former Ambassador Godley says the following: I have testified under oath that it was my opinion and that of my associates when I was in Laos that there were no Americans held against their will by the Party Laos, that is to say the Lao Communist forces. I am not endorsing this one way or the other, but Ambassador Godley is a distinguished professional.
Let me, again, because of the constraints of time, which may ultimately accrue to your benefit, yesterday, and I was present for much of the testimony. I did not hear this particular statement made, but I think I have a verbatim transcript from Winston Lord, one of your top assistants during the negotiation, said, and I believe this is a direct quote, "The President decided not to settle the Paris Agreement, presumably with North Vietnam, over the MIA issue. It was a very tough decision." This seems to connote I don't like to say an abandonment of the POW-MIA question, but a changed position. And I just wondered if you could clarify for the record your interpretation either of that statement or of the operative facts that would have...
I think you will find that Winston Lord, who was not only a close associate but a close personal friend, had left my staff by the time this issue came really to a head. He went with me to Hanoi and to China, and he left my staff very shortly afterwards. The issue of enforcing the agreement came to a head in our internal discussions starting in the middle of March. We had some meetings of the Washington Special Action Groups, and we had many conversations between myself and President Nixon, in which both the Washington Special Action Group and the White House team decided that we would enforce the agreement. The only issue was whether we would do it before the return of prisoners, the last tranche of prisoners, or after. The only thing that Winston Lord could possibly be referring to is that President Nixon decided that he had to have the last tranche of prisoners returned before resuming action, that he could not take the responsibility to the families to delay the return of those 160 prisoners. And even though from the point of view of management of crises, I had a different view, from the point of view of humanity and overall policy, President Nixon was absolutely right in making that decision. But it was not a question of scuttling the agreement, because if we had resumed military operations in April, that would have it would have had also elements of scuttling the agreement.
Dr. Kissinger, I thank you. Several colleagues have voted and returned. Since I have not voted, I will terminate it and turn it over. In fact, the chairman has now returned. I thank you.
Senator Brown is next. Can I just ask a question? Did you say that it would scuttle the agreement to use military action?
I don't believe so, but it was certainly against the provisions of it would have violated the ceasefire aspect of the agreement.
We did, in fact, do that at one point, correct? In Laos.
I believe, I tell you, I have read a North Vietnamese protest that we did it. I don't actually remember that we did it, but it's quite possible.
Senator Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, we appreciate you being here and your answers to the inquiries. I know it is not perhaps the most enjoyable exercise you've been through in the recent years, but I remain convinced that it's worthwhile and important. Rehashing Vietnam is a bit like picking on a sore. It is a sore from all our points of view. I was struck with an impression when I had gone back to Vietnam on the chairman's trip earlier this spring, with a different impression than I have carried for some 20 years. My impression for some 2 decades has been that the U.S. lost the war in Vietnam. We haven't always termed it that way, but that was at least my impression. I came back from Vietnam convinced that both sides had lost, both the United States and Vietnam. And I suspect the proof of that is very evident to those who visit the country. I have been struck by many things you've said today, but perhaps I thought one of the more challenging of all was a statement where you said, I challenge the critics of the Accords to say precisely how they would have achieved a better outcome under those circumstances. I have listened today with some attention to hear an answer to that challenge and hear an answer to that question. It is, after all, part of what we're focused on with this inquiry. I wanted to go through briefly what occurred to me to be potential answers, what I think has been offered, and ask you to comment, and ultimately ask whether or not there are things you might have done, things the President might have done that could have helped. First of all, it strikes me that we could have spoken out. I say we, I mean both the Congress and the executive. You've pointed out, I thought rather forcefully, that indeed the President did speak out, specifically indicating they had not complied with the requirements for full accounting. You've indicated a number of areas where you spoke out, including a statement, quote, we are extremely dissatisfied with the results of that part of the agreement, referring to the accountability. It strikes me any fair observer would find that you did speak out. Secondly, it seems to me that you could demand a full accounting at the negotiating table. As I understand your testimony, you've indicated that you've did that on numerous occasions. Thirdly, one option that seems to present itself is to threaten to bomb North Vietnam or take other military actions in the event they did not come forward with the full accounting. You've indicated that you've recommended that. I've had a chance to peruse the exhibits that are here. New York Times, the Philadelphia Inquiry, the LA Times, Newsweek, Washington Post, Minneapolis Star, the Baltimore Sun, Des Moines Register, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, the Atlanta Journal. There are perhaps some others. All of them speak out in strong opposition to the threat that the President had held out, that there could be potential bombing if they didn't fully comply. Fourth, we could resume military operations. You recommended that. The Congress prohibited it, cut off funds, and specifically voted down a Dole amendment. And I don't want to belabor the point, but I think the debate that took place is very significant. The resolution that Senator Dole offered was this: these restrictions, referring to the Eagleton Amendment that would cut off funds for Vietnam, or for actions in bombing Cambodia and Laos. Dole Amendment said these restrictions shall be of no force or effect if the President finds and forthwith so reports to the Congress that the government of North Vietnam is not making and accounting to the best of its ability of all missing in action personnel of the United States in Southeast Asia. In other words, we had a clear vote in Congress on the question of demanding an accounting from the Vietnamese, and if they didn't comply with that, having the ability to bomb. That measure, as you're well aware, was defeated. 25 members of the Senate voted to demand the full accounting with the threat of bombing. 56 members of the Senate, including 12 that are still members, voted to deny funds for bombing, even if they didn't account for our POWs.
Right.
It is interesting to me that none of the 12 have been called here to testify. But those who recommended that that threat be available to force the Vietnamese to comply with the agreement they had signed have been. I don't mean to imply anything by that. You, frankly, and others that have come, are ones that are the source of knowledge and information in this area. And I think it's appropriate to ask you to come. But I don't think you ought to feel the fact that you've been called is any kind of indictment. It's a request for information. The wounds of Vietnam, I hope, have long healed. But I think it's worthwhile taking a look at the reasoning that went on there. This is Senator Mansfield speaking, and I think he speaks eloquently. There is no person in this chamber who is not interested, if not more interested, in the missing in action, just as we were interested in the release of the POWs, the return of the POWs and the return of U.S. personnel in South Vietnam. I think we ought to face up to the realities and recognize our government has created a joint committee which is now stationed, I believe, in Bangkok for the purpose of finding and identifying some 1,400 or 1,500 personnel still listed as missing in action. Speaking further, he says, and as far as the MIAs are concerned, this government is making every effort, these are the words of Senator Mansfield, and will continue to do so to attempt to identify them. But if we want more MIAs, we should vote for the pending amendment. We should vote for the pending amendment, and we'll get them, just as we are getting them now in Cambodia. The reference there, of course, was the Dole Amendment, voting for the Dole Amendment. His implication being is if we bombed again, we'd have more MIAs. I don't think anyone would question Senator Mansfield's patriotism or his commitment to bringing the MIAs home. He obviously opposed having that threat of force on a matter of principle that he deeply believed in. Senator Dole's remarks, I think, are poignant. He says, all I am saying is that in this one rare instance, in this one small instance, we are talking about American MIAs. Some are from Florida, some are from Kansas, and some are from Missouri. In that one instance where there is no effort made for an accounting, if the President so finds and reports to Congress, we resume the bombings. Well, the issue was clear then. A majority of the Senate voted not to give the President leverage to force the Vietnamese to account. Would that have worked? I don't know. I suspect there's not a member on this committee that would know. But that covers the first four ideas that I've heard mentioned. The fifth is simply to pay ransom. I don't know if you favored that. I suspect, or at least I understand, that you did not. But the facts are that Vietnam did not offer to exchange prisoners for a ransom, or at least as far as we know. And Congress acted to deny the reparations payment, or the payments that were talked about in the negotiations. That door was closed. Those are five things that could have been done. I haven't heard others mentioned. But it seems to me if someone's going to be critical, they ought to be able to suggest what you should have done or what you didn't do that you could have done. And that's really my question to you. Looking back on it with hindsight now, is there something more you would have liked to have seen done in that period?
Senator, you have stated my view on the matter very well. It would have probably taken me twice as long to make these points. But I agree with the options you presented. I believe that that was a fair statement of them. I think the Senate reaction to the Dole Amendment made it very clear what the reaction would be if we made a formal request to resume bombing for the missing in action. I can think of nothing else we could have done other than the 5 points you mentioned, which we, in fact, 4 of them we did do. Ransom, we never had the opportunity. I probably would have opposed ransom, but it never came up.
Is it possible the administration could have been clearer in making the point that the accounting, a proper accounting, was lacking?
Well, I believe that we have we have here only 10 statements that were made between February 8th and January 23rd, because that was, we only decided to put this together last night. I'm sure there are many more. I believe that the fundamental problem was that the division in the country was so great that anything we put forward that could be used as, that could be made to appear as an excuse to increase tensions with Vietnam or to resume military operations was immediately attacked as being either untrue or exaggerated or as a pretext for starting the war again. I believe that we were clear, emphatic, and repeated on that subject.
I thank you. I would just simply close, Mr. Chairman, with a personal observation. I have hoped, and I think every member of this committee has hoped, that we never again enter a conflict in which the Congress of the United States is unwilling to stand behind and stand with the men and women who serve their country in combat.
I think that is the crucial lesson of the war. We should not fight a war we are not prepared to win. We should not fight a war unless the Congress assumes responsibility for it, together with the executive branch.
Mr. Secretary, thank you. I was just reading that debate, and I think that's a really interesting, and I think it's a very important point that Senator Brown has made, and worthy of the committee factoring in here. It underscores to me some of the questions that I was raising earlier, and I want to come back a little bit to them and truly hope that we can settle on an understanding here of what may have occurred. As I read the debate, and I was just reading the debate on the particular resolution, all of the talk in the debate is about MIAs. It's all about an accountability for MIAs. What I was raising with you earlier, and what strikes me in this, and I want to go through a little bit of sort of a sequence to give you an indication and see if you don't agree with me that there isn't something in the public perception that happened that may have also shifted our thoughts about this issue. I have tried to draw from, and also let me say to Senator Brown, I think I said at the outset of this hearing, I think you got the best agreement you could. And I said that at the very beginning. And I am proud to acknowledge there were, as people have written many times, extraordinary moments of your deftness, brilliance, capacity to negotiate very difficult levers. And I want that on the record. This is not about your ability to negotiate an agreement. We concede that you've made your mark in history on that. This is about what happened in America to perhaps create a confluence of events that, beyond anybody's ability to change it, may have contributed to this lack of accounting. Now, I assert that there is a distinction between talk of MIAs and that which has driven this issue over the years. People are interested in getting an accounting of MIAs, but people are passionate, just emotionally entangled in concern over POWs. And the case that I read to you at the outset of this hearing was not about an MIA. It was about a POW. Now, my own impression is that Americans would have reacted differently at that point in time over a debate if someone went to the floor and they were not debating abstractly about accountability for MIAs, but they were debating specifically about Mr. Sparks, or specifically about Ronald Dodge. And somebody came to the floor and said, Ronald Dodge was a prisoner. We saw his photograph. We know he was held. They paraded him through the street. He didn't come home. Now, let me just, and I say this not because to challenge you, because I don't think you, from what I can see from the record, had all of that hard information in front of you all the time. I'm not sure it was on the radar. But what I do know happened is this, that there is a big distinction between what our government was saying and what you were saying to the American people and to the Vietnamese before Operation Homecoming and our attitude towards this issue after Operation Homecoming. Specifically, and I'm struggling to understand that distinction. It centers around the Roger Shields time of that press conference, around the time of the President's speech. Before Operation Homecoming, our officials in the military and you in the executive expressed the conviction that POWs were about to be left behind because the Laos list was incomplete. But after Operation Homecoming, the statement seemed to have shifted and been calibrated more towards putting people at ease and urging an acceptance or encouraging the belief that the goal had been achieved. Now, to illustrate, let me just share with you. And I'd say this only to help us understand if something triggered, maybe a release of relief or something. On February 1st in 1972, you said to Marvin Kalb in an interview, quote, "It doesn't look to us as if the Laos list could be complete." And you've acknowledged that. And there was talk about maybe 40 more or so. The next day, on February 2nd, the President cables the North Vietnamese foreign minister that, quote, "The list of American prisoners held in Laos, which was presented in Paris, is unsatisfactory." And you've so stated here today. We called it to their attention. So in February, it's unsatisfactory. In March, you send a message to Le Duc Tho saying that the U.S. side has become increasingly disturbed about the question of American prisoners held or missing in Laos. I emphasize this is all Laos, not Vietnam. The U.S. side has made clear on many occasions that the list of only 9 prisoners presented belatedly by the Pathet Lao is clearly incomplete. The reason it was presented belatedly, as you remember, is the North Vietnamese actually held these people and set up a fiction of returning them through the Pathet Lao, but in point of fact, the Pathet Lao never returned anybody nor accounted. On March 22nd, Admiral Moorer orders a halt to the withdrawal, pending receipt of, quote, "a complete list of all U.S. POWs, including those held by the Pathet Lao." 1 day later, Admiral Moorer rescinds his order of the previous day and tells General Woodward of the negotiating team, quote, "We intend to pursue the question of other U.S. personnel captured or missing in Laos following the release of the men on the February list." On March 27th, Acting Secretary of Defense Eagleberger says in a memo, the Pathet Lao, quote, "may hold a number of unidentified U.S. POWs. Though we cannot accurately judge how many, there appears to be the need for a well-orchestrated plan for solving the problem of Laos POWs and MIAs." But then on March 29th, that's 2 days later, Operation Homecoming is complete, and literally the tone shifted. The Commander-in-Chief, the President, while he did acknowledge that there were still MIA problems, said that all the prisoners are home, even though, as I said, we had people we thought were prisoners who weren't home. In your book, you cited the notion, and I only say this to document the concept that we were concerned about the return of prisoners. You said, when Nixon addressed the nation on March 29th to mark the return of our last prisoners of war, not the ones on the list, but our last prisoners of war. Indeed, that's about the time that Roger Shields makes his comment. About a week later, Dr. Shields attends a meeting with the President where the question of whether there are indications that the POW MIAs are alive is apparently discussed, according to memoranda we have. And then you go through a series in which the Secretary of Defense bars any changes of status from MIA to POW, even though there were 50 recommendations plus that people now be recorded as POW. So my only concern here, and maybe you can explain it to us, is what happened to shift this notion that we needed this plan that Elliot Richardson referred to? What happened to shift away from these people that we knew to be POWs with a specific name, face, and history into this sort of abstract discussion of MIAs? Or were you even privy to that? It may be that you had because it's been told to us by a number of people that at that point, your attention was shifting somewhat to the Soviet Union and China, and you were sort of in and out of this at that point.
Mr. Chairman, first of all, my attention wasn't shifting from the American prisoners and the missing in action, and I went through 4 weeks or nearly 4 weeks of negotiations on the enforcement and carrying out of the peace agreements from May 15th, give or take, until June 13th. So my attention was certainly not shifting, although there are very many amateur psychiatrists around who are happy to explain to you what motivated me at various stages, and in inverse proportion to their knowledge of what I thought. So one problem, Mr. Chairman, and we won't have time this afternoon, that really ought to be discussed is this. This committee has correctly called attention to the overclassification of documents and to the importance of making more information available. But I would tell you as a historian that the present procedure of having hundreds and thousands of documents analyzed by lawyers who are very able and very fair-minded, and then taking one sentence out of these documents, when every negotiation, when there were hundreds of hours of negotiation, each negotiation preceded by an equal number of preparation, each preparation embedded in hundreds of hours of collateral conversations, and all of this enmeshed in a domestic civil war. I would urge, when this is over, that serious people get together between the executive branch and the Congress and try to figure out a way by which both the need of declassification, the need of history, and the need of fairness are taken care of. And I'm not implying that there's any deliberate unfairness.
No, we would hope that could happen.
Now, you have presented a truly bewildering array of facts, semi-events, events that have no necessary relation to each other. It is true that in our mind, at least at first, there were only 2 categories, prisoners or missing. And in our mind, if somebody was not a confirmed prisoner, he was missing. Now, the case of this, I forget what his rank was, captain, or, I know exactly the case you mean, because it is the most flagrant case of those that I presented. That case, we may have thought that he probably died under circumstances that they did not want to reveal. Or we had not established a gray area for 1 or 2 of these cases. In our mind, however, our dissatisfaction with the missing in action was that we did not know whether they were alive and we did not know whether they were dead. And we wanted very badly to get that issue settled. This is how it appears to us. Now, you have mentioned, and Senator Smith mentioned to me privately and indicated he might wish to pursue it himself, that the events of that week of the 20th to the 28th, and I have seen newspaper accounts that this seems to be a seminal event. I was on vacation, actually, during that week, so I was not a personal participant, though I want to emphasize I am responsible for any action taken by the National Security Office, and I had perfectly good communications. I was just not in the day-to-day discussions. My perception of the strategic problem was as follows. We had the problem of getting the prisoners back on May 28th. March 28th. we had the problem of getting the prisoners back on March 28th. We knew there were 150 in Vietnam and 10 that were ascribed to the Pathet Lao, but who probably were in the category which you correctly described as having been held in North Vietnam, given to the Pathet Lao, and returned by the Pathet Lao then as part of the peace process. We had as bargaining chips the withdrawal of forces, which at that point was of minimal significance because I think there were only 5,300 left, none of them having a combat capability and none of them being relevant to what we might want to do. On my scope, these were bargaining chips for the March 28th thing. On my scope, the big game was the resumption of military operations. My view was to attack the Ho Chi Minh Trail and associated areas, but it doesn't matter what the purpose was, and that is what I was focusing on. That was related to the issues that were left after we had our prisoners back, among which the missing in action, what we called the missing in action, were a principal element. And to me, the Richardson Memorandum was not a spectacularly new document because I had already made all the points in the Richardson Memorandum to Lee Dak-to and Pham Van Dong on February 10th and 11th in Hanoi. That was conventional wisdom. It was perfectly correct. And for the second part of it, how you then get it observed in the strategic concept that I pursued or that I believed in, it would have been taken care of in that general, in the context of overall military operations and not in the context of the missing in action, of the return of the last tranche. On the messages of Admiral Moore, he will testify here himself, and he will no doubt give you his perception. Admiral Moore never sent a message without approval, never would have canceled a message without clearance, and therefore the question is, what did he mean in certain phrases? I interpret what he said was, we want those 10 Laotian prisoners back on March 28th, and we are holding up our troop withdrawals until then. I would be amazed if he had in his mind the list on the missing with respect to the troop withdrawal issue. My attention didn't wander. My concern didn't wander. Now, I do feel I owe President Nixon one comment. I worked with him for over 4 years. I was never a supporter of his before he became president, and he did me the honor of appointing me, even though I had been a lifelong opponent of his. And we were not personal friends, but respected each other's views. In the field of foreign policy and national security policy, I never saw him engage in any political motivation. What he had subconsciously, a lot of people can say, he took huge risks in difficult circumstances when it seemed like the mining of Hanoi, of Haiphong, 2 weeks before a summit, 6 months before an election. And it is true, I wrote in the years of upheaval that Watergate influenced what happened in April. But Watergate influenced what happened in April, not in terms, in my view, of the president's decision, but in terms of what the Congress was already doing starting in January. And it was just becoming bolder and more assertive. And that is the sadness, of that period. Certainly Watergate was one element, but I believe that I'd be very frank with you, Mr. Chairman. When the war ended, I thought the people who were for peace and the people who gave priority to honor would come together. But many of those who had been opponents of the war seemed to feel that if anything was left of that war, America might do it again. And therefore, many moved heaven and earth to prevent what was needed, which was help to Saigon and some of these other measures. I know this is my version now of psychology, but this was the sadness. If we could have come together afterwards, if you and I could have gone to the Congress and said this needs to be done, it would have been done, and we might not be here today.
Well, that may well be, and it is part of the sadness of the time. It is a statement about the consistent sort of process of loss of credibility, beginning with Lyndon Johnson and going all the way up, and that's where we wound up. It is a tragedy. The only question I guess I was really getting at, and Senator Cole is here, and I don't want you to answer my question now, but I laid it on the table, sort of was whether that bringing together might or might not have been enhanced, query, and I only say query, if there had been something more forthcoming about the beliefs and doubts which we're now hearing expressed by these higher officials 20 years later. If more people, in a sense, had been debating a name rather than an abstraction, query, and I only say query, whether that would have made a difference or not. I don't have the answer to that, maybe you don't either, but I think it is an answer one has to ask, a question one has to ask. There's another document here that's sort of a key document, but I can't ask you it now because we did promise Senator Cole if he came back from presiding, he could.
And you understand, I really cannot stay more than 15 minutes longer.
It is Senator Cole's time, and
Thank you.
we'll try to fit in what we can. Maybe we could have it on the record.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'll get right to my question, Dr. Kissinger. Dr. Kissinger, we all know what you said about your state of knowledge with regard to the POW issue in 1973. Can you hear me?
Yeah, not very well.
Pull it a little closer.
You got to get it right up here.
Dr. Kissinger,
Now I can hear you.
we
Thank
know
you.
what you've said about your state of knowledge with regard to the POW issue in 1973, but based upon what you know now, in 1992, do you believe that live Americans were held in Indochina after Operation Homecoming?
As I stated it, I really cannot go beyond my statement. I think it is possible that they were held, and it would have been in total violation of the agreement. We did not have any information at the time that I was in government that was considered reliable.
Yeah, I don't doubt what you said, but all of us are sitting here today and wondering what was the case then, and we all try and make the best judgment we can. What is your best judgment as to now, today? Would you suggest that perhaps some POWs were held after Operation Homecoming?
I said to the families of the missing in action, I believe it was 1974, that I believed it was possible that a few were held in Laos, and that's about as much as I can say today.
All right. Dr. Kissinger, assume that in 1973, after the accords were signed, assume that you had absolute evidence, hypothetically, that 200 alive Americans were being held in North Vietnam and Laos. What would you have done at that time? Would you have advised the President to make that information public? Would you have advised him to continue and perhaps even to intensify the war until those people were released, even though that might have led to additional American fatalities and POWs?
Talking about what period now, Senator?
Back in 1973, after the accords were signed, if you then had absolute evidence that there were live Americans.
No, I would have, my recommendation off the top of my head, certainly I would have made it public. I would probably have recommended giving Hanoi a very brief time period in which to return them, after which I would have declared the ceasefire void and resumed military operations. assuming we could have got requisite support. That would have been my recommendation, I believe, now.
All right, well, I'll come back to that. Let us move away for a minute from the specifics of Vietnam and ask a few general questions, Dr. Kissinger. In your view as an historian, would it be fair to say that the use of POWs and MIAs as bargaining chips is not unusual in war?
I would say that's correct.
All right, as a policymaker, would you recommend the continuation of a war that you could not win, a war which would, as all wars do, extract a terrible human cost, in order to get a clarification of the status of MIAs and suspected POWs? To put it another way, when you make a policy decision about whether to end a war, is it legitimate to say that the benefits of ending the conflict outweigh the cost that we would have to pay if some of our soldiers were left in captivity or never had their fate determined with any certainty?
Certainly.
All right. Again, as a policymaker, do you think it would be helpful if the United States had a clearly articulated policy about POWs and MIAs? We have, for example, an overt policy on terrorism. We will not negotiate with terrorists holding hostages. Would a similar overt policy about POWs and MIAs be helpful?
It depends what the policy is.
Well, for example, that we will never terminate a conflict until we believe that all prisoners returned and all MIAs accounted for, or conversely, that we consider soldiers as elements of the negotiating process and will not yield to certain demands simply to secure their return.
I would certainly agree that we should not end the war unless we feel confident we can either enforce an accounting for the missing in action or in fact obtain an accounting for the missing in action.
Well, what decision do you make when you come to a situation in which an unwillingness to terminate the conflict until that final accounting is made, and perhaps there are 100 involves continuing the war, knowing that it will cause casualties of perhaps 10,000?
It's very difficult to answer that question in the abstract. Very difficult to answer the question in the abstract, Senator. In the specific conditions of Vietnam, to which we are now talking, if we had said we will not end the war until we have a full accounting of the missing in action while the war is going on, because that's what you're implying, then the war would never have ended, because the Vietnamese would have believed that no matter what accounting they give us, we would declare it not to be enough and therefore continue the war ad infinitum on terms which we controlled, because only we could determine whether we were satisfied. Therefore, we had to settle on under conditions in which they undertook the obligation to return the missing in action, and where then the solution of this, if it was unsatisfactory, was left, according to my recommendation, to the resumption of military operations. But I would not make a hard and fast rule the way you have described it.
In that case, you're suggesting that had you been certain that there were 100 or 200 unaccounted for after we had made our arrangements and our accords, you would have recommended the resumption of the war?
Almost certainly.
All right, finally, Dr. Kissinger, as both a policymaker and as a historian, do you think that additions should be made to the international law governing POWs? Would it make sense, for example, to have POWs delivered to a neutral party and held by them during the course of a conflict? Is there any way we can make changes in international law so that we can avoid these problems in the future?
I haven't thought about this problem sufficiently. It's worth studying. I simply have not reflected on it enough to testify to it.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We have a couple of minutes extra, do we, Mr. Secretary? Yes. I've had my
I'll go 10 minutes if
go.
Senator Smith, if that's convenient.
Okay. If you could, Senator Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In respect to your time, Dr. Kissinger, let me just touch two areas, and I'll try to do it quickly. The first one relates to the Joint Economic Commission that was formed. Well, actually, Nixon proposed it. I think President Nixon proposed it on February 1. I think you went to Hanoi around the 10th, and then there was a joint communique issued between the two countries on February 14th. There was a meeting on the 15th of March, the 19th of April, the 18th of June, and the 25th of July are the ones that I'm aware of. There may have been others. At the last meeting of that Joint Economic Commission, the United States suspended the talks, and the reason we did was, or right after the last meeting, we suspended the talks, and the reason was because the Vietnamese were not cooperating on POWs and MIAs. On August 1st, Vietnam's foreign ministry accused us of delaying and using the typical propaganda. Then the Vietnamese media accused us of having agreed to the plan of the Joint Economic Commission and then stepping away from it. Now, I gave you a copy of what was submitted to the Montgomery Commission in 1975, Montgomery Committee, I believe, not the Commission. Did we agree with that document, which lists a huge amount of specific items that we would give to the Vietnamese as a form of economic aid if, in fact, the conditions of the POWs were met?
I will have to assume yes, but I cannot testify from my own knowledge. That must have come out of the Commission.
Right. Well, the key is they're saying that we agreed to it and then pulled away from it. And
they knew that all of this was what it's called ad referendum, that this is something that they were going to discuss, that then, at a minimum, before we agreed to it, we would have to submit it to the Congress. I mean, there were endless discussions about this.
Well, the key is, the key here is that I still believe that one of the real problems that we face is the result of, the reason why we're still having problems is I believe the Vietnamese correctly or incorrectly concluded that economic aid was tied directly to these, to the POW issue, even though that may have not been the intention of the administration. I think that's what they thought.
If General Walters is a good interpreter, they couldn't have had that view.
Well, the point is in March and April, the 28th of March, 25th of March was when we implemented the final phase of the agreement regarding prisoners, and we had this first meeting on the 15th, and there was this list of things was drafted. That's all. The point I'm just trying to make is that that we got down to some pretty specific items regarding economic aid. But if you say did you say we did or did not agree to it? I didn't hear what you said. You don't think we did?
I hate to confess that I was not in charge of everything, as is always alleged. I've never seen this list,
they accused us of not signing it, so they said that we agreed to it and then didn't sign it. That's what they accused us of.
That doesn't mean that it isn't a valid list. It just means that it didn't go through my hands. But it was always understood that the only context of economic aid, and if you read all the things that we ever said, it was in the context of peace and in compliance with agreements. And the Vietnamese have a peculiar system in which they violate literally every provision of an agreement. And then they say, but on a unilateral statement you've given to us, that one has to be carried out in the name of the agreement.
Let me quickly move to the last item. And in a chronology that I put together, there's probably 25 references over a period of 3 months to POWs in Laos by various administration officials during the time of the accords from roughly February 1st, end of January, right through March 21st. And the question I have, on March the 21st, and again, I'm looking, the picture that I'm trying to get at here is I believe, I don't see any difference looking at it today, and I realize looking at it today might be different than looking at it in a contemporary manner, but looking at it today, I don't see any difference between what we were doing before the agreement was implemented and after the agreement was implemented regarding the information we were collecting on Laos. I don't see any demarcation line. Now, let me just quickly reference that. On March 21st, we told the Vietnamese in writing, quote, "The withdrawal of U.S. forces will be completed in accordance with the terms of the agreement and coincident with the release of all, I repeat, all U.S. POWs held throughout Indochina. Withdrawal of U.S. forces will commence after the U.S. has been provided a complete list of all U.S. POWs, including those held by the Pathet Lao, as well as a date, time, and place of release." We already had February 1st lists, which we knew of. Thus, we didn't stick to the terms of the March 21st letter because on March 21st, we told the Vietnamese we're not going to withdraw until we get a list of all the POWs in Laos. That's what we told them. But we did. And that's my point. What happened, what was different in that week that led the administration to go ahead and implement the agreements and to accept that the last POWs from Vietnam? Did you ever, you mentioned the Congress. Let me have one more question, and I'll take your answer. You mentioned the Congress. Did you consider coming to the Congress and saying,
no,
look, guys, if we don't
I don't think the key impact of the Congress was in that week. The key impact of the Congress, as I remember it, was in the period, in two periods. First, from around February 15th to March 15th, from the time that President Hu visited the West Coast, and it was already a painful thing that he couldn't visit, that he couldn't be received in Washington for fear of demonstrations. And the middle of March, when a big campaign started, that we did not have the right to enforce the agreement. This was in general. And then the next big impact occurred, in my mind at least, I'm only giving you my mind, from about the beginning of April until building to a crescendo in the various resolutions that cut off all possibilities of military action at the end of June 1973. In the period March 21st to March 28th, I went on vacation. I would not have gone on vacation if I had thought that was a seminal week. I interpret these messages, which you have to remember are drafted by tired, harassed people at the end of the day when they said, get a message off to General Gay. We did not have the benefit of legal advice of how do we phrase this so that Mr. Codina can't catch us 20 years later in some seeming inconsistency. We drafted, what I interpret this message to be is, apparently what happened was that the Laotian prisoners were not on the list that were supposed to be released on March 28th. Therefore, I interpret the Mura message to mean we want these Laotian prisoners on that list and we want them released March 28th. And when that was done, I guess then it proceeded. But to my thinking, I did not pay as much attention to the 5,300 that were left, frankly, as I did to the intention of what we were going to do in April.
Well, I know we have to wrap up. Let me just say this. My only concern here is that it was emphatic that the March 28th agreement would not be implemented unless and until some type of accounting was made for those that we believe. I mean, you're shaking your head, Mr. Cutler, but the documents support that. I've got the documents.
You're undoubtedly reading the document correctly. But you would have to ask the drafters of the document. In my mind, and I was responsible for the overall strategy. In my mind, there were two separate problems. One was the March 28th release. The other one was to get enforcement of the agreement, including especially missing in action. And the President had decided, President Nixon had decided that this was not going to happen until there had been, until the enforcement was not going to happen until the 160 came back. So I look at the messages in the period March 21st to March 28th in that context.
But final point, I know you, final point. The thing is, what happened, the Vietnamese did not comply by doing what they said they would do regarding Laos. And the agreement was a side agreement with Laos between the Royal and the Pathet Lao, and we weren't a party to it. So we were the Lao issue was hanging out there, and my point is that if your concern, as you indicated in your testimony, was that we wouldn't have the support to resume bombing or to whatever we ever had to do to bring the Lao back to the table or bring the Vietnamese back to the table on this, then why didn't you just come to the Congress and say, okay, guys, here's the story. We haven't got the information yet on Laos. We're getting information. There may be POWs there. Now, are you guys prepared to support us to resume the bombing to get them, or what do you want us to do? I mean, to me, that would have been a sensible plan of action.
I tell you, Senator, if you, Senator Kerry, and I could have gotten together to do that, that would have been the right thing to do. We had never quite reached, and I don't know what President Nixon would have done at the point that he decided to resume the bombing. He decided in early April, as he said in his book on Vietnam, whatever it's called, No More Vietnams, whatever the book is called, he said...
made a big impression on you. No.
I beg your pardon? He said that he decided not to bomb in April because the Ho Chi Minh Trail was closing down anyway. And secondly, this he did not say, but I know that, because he wanted the other negotiation to continue. What he would have said to the Congress in June, how he would have positioned it, I cannot tell you. And I think in retrospect, and I've said this often, we in the Nixon administration took too much upon ourselves. We made a mistake in feeling that our responsibility to the national honor required us to do things, and it would probably have been better positioned on a number of issues if we could have had a broader consensus.
Your last statement, Mr. Secretary, is a very important one.
May I read, however, Senator, the decision that was made at a WASAC meeting about this last tranche that you're talking about. The U.S. troops in the third tranche who are still in Vietnam will not be withdrawn until the third tranche of POWs has been released. The third tranche of POWs. The withdrawal of the remainder of the troops will not begin until we have received the list of the last group of POWs, and the withdrawal will not be completed until all of our POWs, including those in Laos, have been released. That meant to us, including those 10. And I think one of the difficulties in the discussion here is that we only had two categories, listed POWs and missing in action, and that the gray area, we did not have a specific category.
That was from what that you read? Because I want to make sure we focus on this.
March 13th, Washington Special Action Group, which is the basis for the decisions of Admiral Mora. I hope that's what his recollection is, too.
Mr. Secretary, we've given your counsel one document, and in good faith, number one, I want to say that this document did not leak, and I think you will agree it is a document which, if someone were really out to make mischief, it's a document that without explanation one could try to make mischief with. And it is also a document that any of us here today certainly could have tried to make mischief with. I present it to you not to make any mischief, but because it is declassified, the public is going to see it. And I'm not going to characterize it. I assume it has something to do with a negotiating strategy, but read on its own without explanation, it might be subject to other interpretation. I wanted to ask you if you want to put it on the record today. This is, do you have that one there?
Yes.
Do I need to read any of it, or do you want to
No,
explain
I know what it says. And this was a discussion with President Chu in August 1972.
The document will be put into the record.
You know, in a way, it's not, I don't know whether it's very fair to throw this document out when you know I have to leave.
I'm happy to have you file a written response, and we will not make it public until you do. We will not make it public until you do. There's no trap here, Mr. Secretary. There are a lot of questions, and if I had wanted to make this a big issue, I obviously could have read it myself and made something of it. It will not be made public and we will solicit your written explanation.
I will answer it now, because it can only create the impression that something terrible is being kept secret.
Well, sir, the problem is this has been released, I gather, from the executive.
But, Mr. Chairman, you asked for the declassification, so you can't say now that you're not responsible for its being released. And it's a very curious procedure where you people can fish around to find something that you think might be potentially embarrassing, put out nothing that is on the other side, and make a case for which is what I've been saying all along.
Mr. Secretary, I'm not trying to make any case with this, I assure you. I personally have given this to your counsel, and we're asking you in the nicest fashion. I'm not trying to create something, but...
I wish you had raised it this morning, where we could have spent an hour on it, or half an hour on it, but I will answer it now.
I thought truly that I was being fair to you by not allowing this to be one of the records released today that doesn't have an explanation. And I don't know how, I suspect I know how to interpret it.
Mr. Chairman, one way to have done that would have been this morning to raise it and to go through it systematically.
Mr. Secretary,
and in that case, I have nothing to hide in this document. This was a conversation with President Chu at a moment when I thought the negotiations were breaking. And when the problem in these negotiations, when my problem was to keep in harness the various elements of the negotiation, keeping in mind that the American people were eager to have the war ended and beginning to see that the North Vietnamese might be willing to concede our program. President Chu was concerned that we would, I don't have the exact document here now, but President Chu was concerned that we might settle for a ceasefire with North Vietnam only in return for our prisoners. And I was trying to reassure him on the point that I made all morning, that we had not fought a war for 4 years simply to get our prisoners back, that we would remain dedicated to the independence of his country, which was our position. You are referring here to one statement where I say I hope they don't make this offer, and there are several statements in there where I said, one, we will stop at nothing to get our prisoners back. Secondly, if they accept our May 8th proposal, we are bound to accept it, which is exactly what we did, Mr. Chairman. When they accepted our May 8th proposal, we accepted it, and the very people who sometimes say we didn't do enough to get our prisoners back are also sometimes saying we then did it behind the back of President Chu. I told him if the May 8th proposal is accepted, we will accept it, and we did that. I told him we did not want a ceasefire only for prisoners, and that is what happened. I said, we hope they don't offer us the prisoners under these conditions. I had the problem of convincing him that we were not selling him out and convincing him also that we would honor our word to the American public. And as far as I'm concerned, as long as you publish with it what I've just told you, you can release this document.
Well, that's why I wanted the explanation. Mr. Secretary, to this moment have not tried to make this document inflammatory. I think you will agree that if one wanted to, one could play with it. I haven't done that. I've simply asked you...
No, Mr. Chairman, one could play with it, but not honestly.
Well, I agree. That's why I asked you for your explanation of it. It hasn't leaked to the press. Nobody wrote about this ahead of time. There's been no effort to sabotage you. We just have quietly tried to ask you for your personal explanation. And the reason I brought it up without leaving at the end is simply I thought it would be unconscionable for us to have this in the public, to try to interpret it without you personally being able to speak to it. And I thought it was more important to do that than not to do it, and to have you leave without having had a chance to do it.
My problem, Mr. Chairman, is if I leave now, will it be said I fled?
No, Mr. Secretary, we had clear understanding and ground rules. We knew that you would be leaving even earlier than this. You have stayed longer, and we appreciate it enormously. If I could just say personally, I am sympathetic to and understanding of your frustration with this process, notwithstanding the fact that you welcomed this inquiry. I personally believe that it is one of the marvels of our system, maybe an expression of the genius of our political system, that I, who had an opposing position to yours and who spoke out about it, and you, who was frustrated by many of those who did, could be sitting here at a table like this 20 years later on behalf of our country, looking openly and honestly at this issue. And I think that says an extraordinary amount about us, about you, about the system. And I thank you for this committee and for the Senate process for being here, notwithstanding what I know is a personal reticence in having to deal with all of this at this point in time. So I'm very grateful to you for the Senate and for the American people.
Mr. Chairman, I appreciate your comments. I appreciate the way this hearing has been conducted. We were on opposite philosophical sides, but we both had the same objective, and the real problem is how we can now serve this objective in the future, hopefully on the same side.
We appreciate it. We stand in recess until Thursday morning.
Where's